Everyone, we're ready to begin. Good evening and welcome to the Milburnie Dam Mitigation Bank Public Information Workshop. My name is Matt Ferragudo. I'm going to be the moderator this evening. I want to begin by thanking everyone for taking time out of your schedules to be here with us tonight. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to give the public an opportunity to learn more about the proposal by Restoration Systems to remove the Milburnie Dam. As many of you know, the proposal is currently under consideration by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And tonight we have with us Gene Gibby and John Thomas from the Corps, and they'll speak later tonight about where the proposal stands in the permitting process and what lies ahead of us. Here's how the workshop will proceed. A few of the experts here tonight will speak about the Milburnie Dam, its impact on the environment, and the impact removing it will have. After the speakers' presentations are complete, members of the audience will have an opportunity to raise questions to our full team of experts and the representatives from Restoration Systems. Our speakers have a lot of ground to cover tonight and a great deal of information to share with you. So we ask you to please keep all of your questions till the end, and then we'll make time for Q&A then. Now, please let me begin by introducing our speakers and experts gathered here today, and I'll do it in the order that they're seated. First, John Pryor. He's the Chief Operating Officer for Restoration Systems. Next, George Howard is the President for Restoration Systems. Next is Adam Rigsby. Adam is the co-founder and president of Riverbank Ecosystems, and he wrote the Milburnie Dam Prospectus with Restoration Systems. Adam has a PhD in environmental sciences and engineering from UNC Chapel Hill. His expertise is in river processes, water quality, and designing, permitting, and implementing complex river restoration projects. Adam will be presenting here tonight on behalf of the entire team of experts. Adam's been working on this project since 2006, so very few people know the Milburnie Dam like he does. And he spent hundreds of hours at the dam and paddling on the Neuse River. Next to Adam are four experts who have been involved with the project from the beginning. They won't be speaking, but will be available to answer your questions afterwards. First, Matthew Cusack is a senior scientist with Atkins Global, one of the world's leading engineering and design consulting companies. Matthew is responsible for geomorphic and water quality monitoring for this project. He has 14 years of experience in environmental consulting and has supported and overseen many large-scale environmental projects in his career. Next, Tim Savage is an expert in aquatic ecology, and he's the environmental supervisor for the Katina Group in Hillsborough. He conducted the freshwater mussel study for the Milburnie Dam project. Tim has 21 years of experience conducting protected species surveys, aquatic surveys, flora and fauna investigations, natural resource investigations, as well as project oversight. Michael Wood is not here yet, right? He'll be arriving shortly. He's also the president of the Katina Group. Next is Adam McIntyre. Adam is a senior project scientist with Cardno Entrix. He conducted the engineering study for this project. And then next to him is Emmett Perdue, also from Cardno Entrix. Finally, I'd like to introduce Gene Gibby and John Thomas, both from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who will be available to answer questions here as well. Gene is the chief of the Raleigh Field Office, and John is a senior project manager for the Corps. Now I'd like to hand it over to our first speaker of the evening, George Howard.
We got one loose mic. So here. Or left. Hello, hello. Thank you very, very much, Matt. I appreciate that. Nice introduction. As Matt said, my name is George Howard. I'm president and co-founder of Restoration Systems, a company that John Pryor, my partner, and I started about 15 years ago. It's a new industry, as most of y'all probably have figured out, and we were some of the first people in it, though, and some of the most experienced in the country. What I wanted to give you today was probably one of the shorter presentations, but some of the important stuff on the people who run the company and a little bit of background. But people wonder what we do for a living, and we owe people an explanation of that. And we try to explain it on our website and elsewhere, but it continued to be a little bit confusing. So what I'm going to do is give you a little explanation of what we sell, why we sell it, how that came to be, how compensatory mitigation, is handled by the federal government, why it's demanded by state and federal government, what mitigation banking is in general, how that's a reaction to the permitting system, who our company is, what we do, a little of our background, and then finally how we settled on the Milburnie Dam and how that came to be. First, all of this is based in, Ms. Gibby will go into this in somewhat more detail, but I think we need to start with where all this started. It started, the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, and that established a permitting system that demanded that people who impact waters of the United States, and that could be everything from creeks to wetlands, have to get a permit from the state and federal government. And that's called Section 404 is your federal permit, and that's what John and Gina are in charge of. Then there's a state permit called Section 401 that's handled by the state, also pursuant to the Clean Water Act. And all of this came to be after these began to be developed in the 70s. George Bush Sr. said, when you do these permits, your end goal shall be, read my lips, no net loss of wetlands, no net loss of streams. That when these resources is taken as best as we can, we need to replace their function and values. And that was again in about 1988. He said that in his first campaign, I think, and that became the policy of the federal government, which led to a business. And that business is driven by a process that's generally known as sequencing, okay? And when someone goes in and says, I would like to build a road across a wetland, in a rather simplistic way, they have to go through a three-step process that could be quite complicated. And the first step of the process is to avoid the impact altogether to the resource, because that's what everybody would prefer. So you have to show that you have some need to do your project. Again, this is not our company. These are the people who buy from us. They must avoid the impact of the environment as best as they can. No unnecessary impacts. After they pass that test, they need to minimize their impact to the environment best they can, and that's using best engineering practices, best water quality control practices, using modern techniques to make your footprint as small as possible. Okay, and then finally, after they've avoided and minimized, they have to mitigate, okay? And mitigation is an offset for the losses, okay? And mitigation can be the restoration, enhancement, preservation, and in some cases creation of what is being lost to compensate in a reasonable proximity, generally a fairly small watershed, maybe size of 3 counties. The one that this will work in will be basically from Roxborough to Goldsboro, and that you must offset those. That used to happen on site. And actually, it's called compensatory mitigation. And the idea there is that you're compensating the environment and you're mitigating something bad. You're not making it whole, you can't make the bad stuff go away, but you're doing your best, the government is, to make things balance out somewhat. Okay, so then, after this emerged from the Clean Water Act, they established a sequencing procedure to receive permits. It demanded something, compensatory mitigation, and that created an economic demand for other people to provide mitigation to the folks who were doing the damage to the environment. Now, someone who damages the environment receives those permits is perfectly welcome to go out and do their own mitigation. But that wasn't terribly economic, wasn't very efficient, they weren't terribly good at it because those people were developers, they weren't in the restoration business like our company is. So then a system came along called mitigation banking to respond to that. And both governments, nonprofits, and commercial enterprises like ourselves can all establish mitigation banks. Anyone can, any of you could. And that's another permitting process, one that we're involved now that Gina will explain in a bit. So across the country, since the mitigation banking regulations came into place about 1995, there have been more than 600 mitigation banks permitted. So this is not, although it's kind of an obscure subject, it's not brand new. This isn't the first one, and mitigation banks are well accepted across the country. Let me talk a little bit about the company. Okay, we started it in 1998. John and I had a long public policy history in wetlands and environmental management. Started a company, small company, still is a small company, but we've done a lot of good work across the country. We've established more than 40 wetland mitigation banks and sites, roughly as much as anyone in the country, one of the larger companies in a small industry. Totals up to somewhere around 25,000 acres of wetlands in various stages, wetlands and streams, various stages of development or undevelopment, as the case may be in our business. Then 60 miles of streams, creeks, and rivers. And we've planted, I think we could be up to 2 million now, but we've planted well more than 1 million trees that will never ever be cut down. That's not going to be a factor in this job because that's not what we're doing, but that's the kind of work we did. Those are all native trees. They're always permanent conservation easements. None of the restored land will ever be touched again. So let me go in now and talk a little bit about how we got to the Milburnie Dam and how that came up before we get into the science of it, okay? We didn't just pull out a dart and throw it at a map and say there's a dam we want to take out, nor did we say, even though it is a coincidence, we're going to take out the one that happens to be closest to our office because we're in downtown Raleigh. We did not make this decision, even though we followed the cues of a group that the state and federal government set up in 2002 that was actually formed by the Department of Transportation, put everybody in a room. But the idea was what was called the resource agencies, those that are in control of regulating and enhancing our natural resources together in a room over time and establish a ranking of dams to be removed. Okay, now there are 5,000 dams in North Carolina, believe it or not, somewhere around there, okay? Obviously, they did not take each and every one and give it a score. But these are long-time resource professionals who know the state like the back of their hand from these various agencies, and that included, I should say, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Army Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, our own Division of Water Quality, our Wildlife Resources Commission, Marine Fisheries Commission, Coastal Management, and the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program were all given input into this process. They decided that this was the low-hanging fruit, and this was the first cut of what came out of it. Okay, those were dams that professionals like Mike Wicker from the Fish and Wildlife Service said, these are facilities that would have the greatest bang for the environment if they were removed. They didn't do the red flag testing and the various things that could take them out and make them infeasible, but they just picked the ones that really should come out if many other concerns weren't relevant. Okay, so let's see what happened to the ones that they came up with. Okay, and I'll go ahead and go through them one by one. But so the ones that came out, the Lowell Dam, Lockett Dam number 2 and 3, and y'all can read through there, and I'll go ahead and tell you about each of them a little bit. Lockett Dam number 2, you couldn't take out. Those are dams on the Cape Fear River itself, which are congressionally authorized U.S. government facilities to control navigation in the Cape Fear River itself below Fayetteville and upstream of Wilmington. Okay, those are major facilities. They had a huge bang for the environment if you could take them out, but our company certainly wasn't going to do that. These are U.S. government dams, and it was not our place to do so, and was probably just technically impossible for us to. Mike Wicker with Fish and Wildlife has gone on to do great work at both of these locations, but that wasn't a private operation. It was never going to be. So we took those off the list. Remember, this list came out in 2002. So here we are as business people saying if we want to try to help the government take some of these out for compensatory mitigation, what's possible to do? So knock off number 2 and 3. Then Atkinson's Mill Pond, which is upstream of the Lowell Dam, which we'll talk about in a minute, was the last migration barrier for fish after we took out the Lowell Mill Dam. But it's the oldest operating business in North Carolina, period. It's the oldest incorporated business in the state. It's in Johnston County, and it's a grist mill, and it's very, very historic, and that just wasn't going to happen. It deserves a fish ladder. Perhaps one of those should be put up one day, but the dam is in fine shape. It's not a danger to ever collapse or to be in disrepair, and it wasn't going to get removed by us. Then Fishing Creek Mill Pond, a little bit different situation. The landowner there, this is privately owned dam, government owned, privately owned. He didn't want to sell it. He considered it an essential part that the gentleman owned. It was actually in his front yard on Fishing Creek in, I believe, Halifax County or Edgecombe County. And it was so aesthetically important to a restored home that he had built, and he also happened to be a fairly wealthy gentleman, that it was literally priceless to him. And so that's a talk. You find out, no, we can't buy that. So we can't remove that. We made that decision off the list. Then the Lowell Dam, that came off the list because we did do that. We said this is a great place to do this work. The last time fish were able to migrate through that watershed into the Piedmont was 1810. And if we take this dam out, they'll be able to get all the way up into, I think, almost to Person County for the first time in hundreds of years. We thought that was a wonderful thing. Long story short, we ended up removing it in 2005 and 2006, we think very successfully. And that's us taking it out. Okay? And we'll talk about this procedure. This is not one of concern to us tonight. In this case, after great consideration, the agencies agreed, and these decisions aren't made easily, that it was appropriate to use explosives on part of the demolition of this dam. So that's a dramatic picture, but it was well considered operation. Okay, so after you've taken those out, removed Lowell, we took out another one, the Carbonton Dam, and that's at the juncture of Lee, Chatham, and Moore County, about 15 miles west of Sanford. And we took that out a little differently, and we took it out like we're going to do Milburnie, if we are lucky enough and professional enough to receive our permits. I don't want to assume anything. We picked it apart, poked it, and plucked it, okay? And that's the way Milburnie, and Milburnie will actually be a little bit easier if we're able to do it, because that's a masonry stone dam, and you can take them off like Lego blocks, we believe, okay? So that freed up actually 20 miles of river in Lee, Chatham, and Moore County. And there was some concern about it, and now what we left behind is a wonderful public park. The river's getting used as much or more than ever, and most of the concerns turned out to be somewhat unfounded. But it's not an exact similar situation, but we think that it was a success. Okay, so after Carbonton came out, Progress Energy took out the Buckhorn Dam on the Cape Fear River. Okay, so now you're kind of getting down into the short ones here. Okay, and that's when we picked Milburnie. Okay, these, while we would not do these, is they are not in watersheds that could support the demand for the credits that could be produced. There are two sides to our equation, just like any business person. One, what can we produce at what price? And two, who needs it and how much? In this case, these may have been able to be produced at great effect, and they should come out. The government said they should come out, and they probably will come out one day. But there wasn't the market to support it in those watersheds. So we selected the Milburnie Dam as our target for removal, okay? And that dates all the way back to 2002. And that's my last slide, but let me talk a little bit now about our first introduction to Milburnie and the gentleman who owned it. I was very excited to find out at first that he was one of North Carolina's first conservationists. And this gentleman's name was Howard Twiggs. Probably a lot of y'all know that. And he was a trial attorney here in North Carolina, and I think he was one of the founders of the Environmental Defense Fund back in the 60s, which was one of our first and now one of our strongest environmental groups. So we approached Mr. Twiggs and told him that we had removed other dams and that we wanted his dam to be a part of the removals that have been occurring in the news. And perhaps we should have had a slide on this, but some of you may be aware, and he was immediately aware that yes, when I was a boy, I used to fish out of the Milburnie Dam in the 40s and 50s, and I would catch migratory fish like shad. And I enjoyed that as a child. And then I remembered and didn't know why until I saw the dam come out at Quaker Neck. This was a couple years before we'd approached him. That those fish were blocked in Goldsboro because the power company had built a low-head dam there. It's only about 6 or 7 feet high, right, Mike? It's right outside of Goldsboro. Really nothing anybody ever paid attention to, but it had a huge effect on the ecology and kept all of those fish stopped in Goldsboro, and they couldn't make it to Raleigh. When it came out, he told us, he said he thought that was great. So after 50 years, he saw it go from fishing there as a boy, absolutely devoid of migratory fish, and then fish coming back. And he wanted to be a part of the next step, which was to take the Milburnie Dam out. He did, though, have a lease with the hydroelectric owner that was fairly complex, and it was going to take some time to get out of, some other family considerations, and it was a long talk with Mr. Twiggs, okay? That talk got a lot shorter in 2008 when the 2 young athletes died out there. And long story short, don't mean to put words in his mouth, but I think Mr. Twiggs had had enough. There have been other drownings out there. We've since found out that there have been at least 11, and 8 of those were double drownings. And those double drownings, what happens is somebody gets caught in the hydraulic, their friend or family goes in after them, they get caught too and drown. Now notice that doesn't happen at your local swimming pool. That's because the place that person first went under is a dangerous place, and the second person can't do a darn thing to help them. So when Howard saw that happen, he said, I'm ready to move on this thing. And that was in 2008. We actually had a great meeting with him, very conclusive. We had a contract with Mr. Twiggs. We were all going to move forward on it. And very sadly, he passed away very shortly after that meeting. And we lost a great, great advocate for this project, that we still, still mourn his loss. So I'm going to leave it at that right now, but I want you to know that, I know there's some people that are opposed to this. That's very, very clear. But we need to keep in mind that there are a lot of people who are in support of it too. And though that interest may be less intense, that interest is there and deserves to be respected as well. And we offer as a demonstration of that support a petition with nearly 1,500 signatures, with hundreds of those with individual public comments where they actually thought it through and said why they wanted it taken out. So there are always two sides to any issue. We welcome both sides, and we are here to answer questions. We look forward to this meeting, and we're here today, we're here tomorrow, we're going to be permitting for months into the future, and there's plenty of time to work on this, and look forward to answer your questions, me personally, and offering these guys to help as well. So I'll leave it off to the scientists now, and hopefully I can answer any of your questions when we're done.
Can I ask you one question, because I have to leave? Is this going to be the last of the series of meetings? And if we want to contact you, will that have to be individually, or will there be another set of public meetings?
At this point, this is to be well, you can never say the last, but there's not another one planned.
Okay.
But you are welcome to contact me through our website's the easiest way, but I've got a card for you right here.
I think I...
Okay.
And if you leave your question with the folks at the sign-in table, they're prepared to take detailed information and make sure we get back to you with whatever answer you need.
Thanks.
Gene?
Did we want to go to Gene and John first?
Good evening, everybody. Okay, all right. My name's Jean Gibby. I'm with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm the chief of the Raleigh Regulatory Field Office. I've been in the Raleigh area for 22 years now, so have been around for quite a while. I've done projects. John is the project manager, so he'll be able to answer specific questions regarding that. But what we want to do tonight is give you an overview of the process, because it's also not just understanding what Restoration Systems does, but understanding what the Corps does as well. So the purpose of my presentation is to briefly describe our permitting process, and exactly what that's all about, because we're going through the individual permitting process here, and give you a very brief overview of the mitigation banking regulations. George just touched on them lightly, and John will hit on them here in a minute. Now, the main points that to take away tonight, more than anything, is that the Corps of Engineers is neither a proponent or an opponent of any project we process. We are only the person who carries out the process. That is our job. It doesn't matter to us if it's issued or not. We have to remain neutral throughout the process. No final decisions will be made this evening by the Corps of Engineers. That is a big take-home point for all of you. We're not making any final decisions because this is part of the process, is to gain the information from you to provide the restoration systems so that we can work through some of the issues that we'll talk about here in just a minute. So why is the Army Corps of Engineers involved in projects, including waters of the U.S. and the wetlands that are adjacent to them? Well, as George mentioned a while ago, the Clean Water Act of 1972, later amended in 1977, is actually administered by the Environmental Protection Agency. But they don't have the manpower or the money to administer it. So the Corps of Engineers, having dealt with waters of the United States and interstate commerce since 1899 under the Rivers and Harbors Act, was the candidate who ended up getting the program. We only got one part of it, Section 404. That's the discharge of fill into wetlands and waters of the U.S. Section 401 is the water quality. So there's a system of checks and balances. We're not experts at everything, and so we would defer to our state sister agencies for that part. Now, what are jurisdictional waters of the U.S.? There's quite a few. Navigable waters, interstate waters, intrastate waters whose degradation or destruction could affect interstate or foreign commerce. And that's a key thing of why our regulations are here. Why does the Corps get to tell you what to do on your property? Because what you do could affect downstream things. It could affect other water. And so that's why we're there. Not to stop it, but to try and, as was stated earlier, balance the pros and the cons of the development of the project. Impoundments of waters, tributaries of waters listed above, the territorial seas, and the wetlands that are adjacent to those bodies of water. Now, once we define the fact that we have a body of water that we have authority over, we have to decide, do we get a permit? What's the easiest permit? We're always looking for the easiest way to permit something. We have nationwide permits. There are 50-some nationwide permits across the U.S., and those are for commonly recurring activities. They have a threshold maximum of a half an acre and 300 feet of stream. If a project will impact greater than that, then we have to go to the next permitting process, which is the individual permitting process. It involves a much more rigorous process. It's required for those activities who have more than minimal impact to the aquatic environment. It exceeds the terms and conditions of the nationwide permit, as I mentioned. This requires a public notice, which some of you in this room received when we did the first prospectus. And then the second one, as John will go through the dates here later on. It's coordination with the interested agencies as well. We're going to be working with Fish and Wildlife Service, Environmental Protection Agency, the National Marine Fisheries Service in some cases, the State Historic Preservation Office, Wildlife Resource Commission, Division of Water Quality. The list goes on and on as to who we are with the interested agencies. And it involves a full public interest review, and I'll hit those public interest review factors here in just a couple minutes. Now, once we have an applicant has waters of the U.S., what they'll do is they'll go out and delineate the wetlands and streams that will be impacted by that project. So for instance, Milburnie Dam is a run-of-the-river dam. It's pretty easy that the water is within the confines of the channel, but then there are adjacent wetlands that we, of course, have a concern about, that removal of the dam could impact those. Now, the wetlands within the project boundary, upstream of the dam itself, and I think some of the ones downstream, have been delineated. We haven't had an opportunity to verify them. As you can talk about, it's a long process, and you don't necessarily have to have the wetlands verified before we enter a permitting process. It doesn't have to be done on the ground. We can enter it. If someone says, all my property's wet, we can run with it. So when we go out in the field, we're looking at this. Does it have an ordinary high water mark? Oops. Whoa, that was not the right one.
Now we're in outer space.
That's right. I wanted, I don't know what I did, but I got something back. Okay. I was looking for a laser here. Normally I have a laser.
Oh, the top right button.
Top right button.
Yeah.
Ah, there you go. Okay. So we're looking for the ordinary high water mark, which is the line impressed along the bank that just limits our jurisdiction. So if somebody comes in and wants to discharge fill material on the bank of the river for bank stabilization, we don't have any authority over that line. It's only the material that goes below that boundary that we can regulate. Now, a wetland. What is a wetland? How do I know what a wetland is? Well, a wetland, it's got water on it. Well, not always. I need to have three things. Plants that are adapted to living in wet conditions, soils, which are typically black or gray in color, and the presence of a water table within 12 inches of the surface for approximately 12 straight days during the growing season. So March to November. When we get out in the field, unfortunately, Mother Nature is not simple. One line runs on up the hill, one line's down the hill. It's where they all intersect is where our regulatory authority. And what will happen is they'll go and hang flags in the trees, and we come out there and check and make sure that it's right. So, in the individual permitting process, when we're working with any applicant, whether it's a banker, whether it's a developer for a large commercial tract, a subdivision, or anything of that nature, the first thing that we'll do is we'll try to encourage them to have pre-application meetings with us. As George says, when that list was done, nobody looked at red flags. So we might know some things that other people don't know, so we ask them to come in and say, hey, that's a red flag, this is a red flag, you need to watch out for this. Pre-application meetings are a great way for them to tease out the things that are wrong, maybe make modifications so that when it comes in for a permit, it's easier in the process. If it just comes in, then it can be hard and rocky because they didn't get enough information to us. We send out something to the public, it's not very thorough, it's hard. You have to understand, it might meet the intent and the regulations of what we have to send out, but it might not be good enough for, my husband looking at it going, what in the world are they doing? But it's what the government says it has to do. And as I said, the reason we're having this is to discuss how they can minimize. Someone comes in sometimes and they're like, I want an acre of wetland impacts for this development. Well, if I can talk them down to less than a half an acre, I can get them to a nationwide permit. So that's the benefit of that pre-application meeting. Now, public meetings. When we had our public notice, and y'all commented to us, some of y'all in the room, you asked for a public hearing. I want you to understand that the purpose of a public hearing is for you to get up and just state your comments, and then you sit down. There is no exchange of information. And so we recommended to Restoration Systems, noting the comments that were coming in, you might want to have a public information meeting. That's the form here, is to solicit, as we've said, your concerns, your comments, for them to take, work with, and work into their document so that it can help address any issues that we have as we go through the process. Because again, this is a process. So when we get a permit application, we've got to have the name and address of the applicant, a description of the proposed activity. In this case, for Milburnie Dam, it was the purpose of the project was to develop a mitigation bank for stream credits. That's the purpose. The wetland stream delineation. Well, the delineation for the permit itself is within the footprint of where the dam is and any fill that would come from that. But we also have to address any wetlands that are drained as a result of that. That's why we've asked them to have the wetlands delineated upstream so we can understand what's happening to the systems if they were to come out. All related activities. Avoids piecemeal. And what that gets to is sometimes we've dealt with developers in the past, what they would do is come in and have 2,000 acres for a subdivision and only permit 500 acres to start off with. And so it's much harder. In our office, we've worked really hard with the public to say, I want the whole 2,000 acres. I want to know what the whole pie is all about so I can evaluate it in its entirety, not one piece at a time. Adjacent property owners. Listing the properties. Now, the way the regulations read, the adjacent property owner is defined as someone who touches the border body, being affected. You know, so if you're in a subdivision and your lot goes all the way down to the river, you're definitely adjacent property owner. Because some of you might be going, well, why didn't I get notified? I'm in a subdivision and we've got property of the homeowners association. Well, we may have notified the homeowners association, but it didn't get to everybody in the subdivision because that's the way the reg reads. Drawings, plans, and sketches, or something else, something that we can understand. Now, suffice it to say, someone could put this stuff on a napkin, and I'm not joking, folks. They could put it on a napkin and give it to us, and if they give us all that, we got to put it out on public notice. Okay? So it can be very simple because realize we work with mom and pop all the way up to large-scale developers. Mom and pop, I might sit there with them and scribble it on the napkin. You know? So then the public notice. The public notice is the primary method of advising all interested parties. The public notice goes out for 30 days. That is by law. It's to solicit the agency and the public comments in the decision-making process. It's distributed to the post office in the vicinity, applicable government agencies, congressional representatives get a copy of this as well, adjacent property owners, specific individuals or organizations. So if I know that I'm working in an area we like the News River Keeper, they would be on the list in this case to let them know what's going on. Or if there was a group that was interested in the Cape Fear, we have the Hall River Assembly. They're a big group. We make sure that they're copied on all of our public notices in that area because we know that they're concerned about the water and the Hall River watershed. For efficiency and economics, we put our stuff on our public notice on our web pages. Now, right now, our website is down. We got hacked. So it should be back up December 14th. That's what we're hoping. So it will be good. It'll be up there again one day, but right now it's not. What I am offering is that this presentation, since we don't have a web page, could be uploaded at Restoration Systems, and at least if you want a copy of it, then you can pull it off their website. If at all possible. All right, the individual permit process. When we're looking at alternatives, we look at it, it's based on the project purpose and need. The purpose and need here is to create a stream mitigation bank. We'll examine different alternatives throughout the process. Public notice contains the applicant's preferred alternative. Okay, there might be other alternatives out there that we'll be talking about with the applicant. The resource agencies will ask questions and bring up. But for the purposes of informing the public, what they want to do is what we're going to tell you about. No discharge will be permitted if there's a practicable alternative to discharge, which would have less adverse impact on the aquatic ecosystem, provided the alternative does not have other significant adverse environmental impacts. Again, it is a delicate balance and weighing of pros and cons. Practicable. Practicable means the alternative available and capable of being done, taking into consideration the cost, this existing technology, and logistics in light of the overall project purpose. As George pointed out about the couple of dams that weren't available because of cost, I can't buy it, so therefore it's not available to me. It's not an option. So George also mentioned and started off his presentation with the sequencing that we go through and evaluating our permits. When we're looking at the potential information for the mitigation site, we're going to be looking at the impact site and a mitigation site in most permit cases. In this case, it's a mitigation bank. So we're looking at what is the viability of the bank with regard to the purpose and need. The Corps makes a determination that potential impacts have been avoided to the maximum extent practicable. We're at a point we don't have enough information to make that decision at this point. We haven't gotten that far. That's the development of the mitigation banking instrument that John will talk about in a minute. Remaining unavoidable impacts will then be mitigated to the extent appropriate and practicable by requiring steps to minimize impacts and finally compensate for aquatic resources. That's in a traditional project. But it's no different than when we look at mitigation sometimes. In a mitigation bank, that was one of the issues that we brought up to Restoration Systems. When the first prospectus came through, they didn't address the wetland drainage. So we, as the Corps, couldn't see the way forward with the mitigation banking instrument because what if it drains the wetlands? How many wetlands would be drained? Would you provide compensatory mitigation for those wetlands? We met with them, talked with them. The next prospectus that came in said, if there are wetland impacts, if the dam were to be removed, we will mitigate for them in that watershed. So it was enough to get us over the hump to get to the mitigation banking instrument stage, but we're not having issued a permit yet, okay? We need to understand, a permit has not been issued at this point. In 2008, the mitigation banking rule came into play. And it stated, in general, we're going to look at mitigation banks as the primary source for credit generation to offset those unavoidable impacts for developers. Used to be it was on site by the developer. A lot of failures, a lot of problems, having to get more later. They go bankrupt. When you're looking at banks and in lieu fee programs, there's a little bit better track record there. There's a history there. They're getting the impacts on the ground. They're building the wetlands, restoring them, putting streams back in place. And so in theory, before we issue a permit, like to the Department of Transportation to build I-540, they'll be going and that mitigation will already be on the ground before it's ever impacted. Getting back at the no net loss that we were required to do. And that's pretty much where off-site, historically, the failure rates were really high. And that's why they got into this. Now, in the process of obtaining a permit from the Corps of Engineers, you have to look at the alternatives. So once we reviewed the alternatives and decide that we've gotten to the least practicable alternative, what we call the LEDPA, we will go into the public interest review factors. A lot of the things, the comments that you brought up during the public notice hit on a lot of these things. The wetlands were an issue. Your recreational opportunities were an issue. Okay? So this is part of the process. Taking that information and listening to it and talking about it and then working through it. To give you an example, when we dealt with some of the past dam removals, yes, there was a certain type of water recreation that was on there, but then they went in and put in maybe a boat ramp, a ramp for kayakers and canoeists that wasn't there before. So they're trying to offset that change. It's still used, but it's a change in use. But as you can see, there's a lot of things that we sit there and decide, is there a pro? Is there a con? And sometimes, is there just no effect? Comments to the public notice are forwarded to the applicant. So we took your comments, we forwarded them to Restoration Systems for incorporation. We sat down with them based upon the comments and said, we really recommend that you hold a public information meeting. Realize that we can't make any customer that we deal with do this. It's just a way to help gain a better understanding instead of, doing it one by one. And this is a common practice for the Department of Transportation, to let people know about certain things when something's coming to their community. A lot of public entities do this. After review of the application, alternatives, public comments, and mitigation proposal, the Corps will determine what is the least environmentally damaging practical alternative to make a decision to either issue or deny a permit. The Division of Water Quality will also consider whether to issue or deny the 401. If the 401 is denied, our permit is automatically denied. That's the way the process works. You can appeal to them and do whatever you have to, but that's... So, I'll hand this over to John, and John can tell you where we are exactly in the process.
Thank you, Chairman. The button advances.
That one right there. About the one that takes you to outer space? Yes, exactly. Cody?
Okay, I'm John Thomas. I'm the project manager for the Corps of Engineers for this Milburnie project. And I hope so far what you've taken for the presentation is that no decisions yet have been made as far as Corps of Engineers permit, Section 404 permit for the Milburnie Dam. What I hope you've taken from this presentation so far is that we're in the middle of a process. And my job as a manager is to be the practitioner for this process. I'm to assure that the process is being followed as outlined by the guidelines of federal and state statutes, and that any information is documented and all determinations and issues that are brought up during the process are addressed, and conclusions are a result of that address. Finally, the decision to issue or deny a permit for the dam removal will be the results of the findings of the process. So that's where we are right now. We're in the middle of a process, and you see from the slide, where are we in this process? Okay, currently, the first bullet you see with the process, we're into the development of a mitigation banking instrument, MBI. And the next slide up that I have for you is a timeline of the development and approval of MBI. Once the MBI for the mitigation bank instrument has been approved, then this mitigation banking instrument will be given to first will be determined complete by the Corps of Engineers, and then it will be given to what's called an interagency review team. Now, the interagency review team is a team composed of state and federal agencies. Members on that team would be EPA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Wildlife Resource Commission, the Corps, Division of Water Quality, possibly the SHPO. They will review the mitigation bank instrument and ultimately approve or disapprove of the mitigation bank. If it is approved, then it goes to this final bullet, which is that we will conclude the process and review of a Section 404 permit. So let's look at, okay, we're going here. This is a timeline I was telling you about. First of all, I didn't realize that, I knew that Restoration System had been working on Milburnie Dam for a number of years, but I didn't realize they'd been working on it since 2006. Really, our first involvement with it probably came about in 2009, 2010. But what was the first step in the process? You see the gray area and the yellow areas. You heard discussions about a prospectus. And the term prospectus means really a proposal. What Restoration Systems did was they put together a proposal to show the benefits of the dam removal, the benefits of a mitigation bank, and also they would identify the potential impacts and how they would address those impacts. The original prospectus was given to us, and we put it out on public notice on, let's see, March 23rd of 2010. Now, this prospectus met the guidelines of the federal regulations. It had the format and the that was required. It was a rather small prospectus. It was, I think, from 12 to 20 pages. But since it was a prospectus that met the guidelines, we did put it out on public notice. As a result of that public notice, it was determined that there was not the prospectus was lacking in enough detailed information to make a determination to go to the next step, which is the green section. That would be to authorize them to actually put together a MBI. And a letter was put out to the sponsors on May 20th, 2010. And included in that letter was details of concerns that we felt were not addressed in the original prospectus. Those details were wetland impacts, sediment discharge, sediment toxins, historic properties. The Milburnie Dam itself is a historical property, water quality issues, and aquatic species modification that would result from the removal of the dam. The sponsors, Restoration Systems, took that, worked on that information, and submitted a revised prospectus to us that we put out on public notice on November 10th of 2011, about a year ago. This prospectus was much more detailed. It was over 100 pages. We put it out on public notice. We got comments from the agencies, we got comments from the public, and it determined that the prospectus was good enough, it met the requirements that would allow us to give them approval to go ahead and work with the MBI. Now let me explain to you the point of this approval. The prospectus was complete enough that it identified the concerns, but the prospectus did not resolve the concerns, but it does give an outline on how potentially they would resolve the concerns. This allows them to go on to the MBI, which will be the full details on how all concerns would be resolved. A letter was issued January 12, 2012 that gave them to gave concurrence with compliance with federal regulations to go ahead and go forward with their MBI. Currently, that's where we are. We're in this green section here. Restoration Systems is developing their MBI. Once it's complete, they will submit it to the Corps. Corps, we look at it and determine if it is complete. If it is complete, then we would put together the RRT team, and then approval would go from there. If it was, again, if it was approved, we go back to the original bullet, then we would enter into the final process of determining whether we could issue a Section 404 permit for that or not. So that's where we are with the process. And like I said earlier, Gene and I will be here during the question and answer period, so if you have questions then, we'll be glad here to address those for you.
A quick question, how long is the final leg of the review of the MBI take?
Final leg,
Once it's submitted to you all?
once it's submitted to us by regulations, we're supposed to come up with a decision within 30 days.
All right, thanks, John, Gene, George. My name is Adam Rigsby. I'm the guy that wrote that document, the prospectus, which is what we're going to talk about today. If you knew how many slides I'm about to show you, you'd probably walk out of here. I promise I'll try to get through them as quickly and as reasonably as possible. But believe it or not, there's a lot more information in that document that I'm not presenting here. So, you know, if you're interested in this project and you want to learn more and you haven't read that, that is a great place to start. If you have questions after this meeting or after reading the document, please contact Restoration Systems and we'll try to address those questions the best we can. So that's the document. This is the 100-plus pager that was submitted back in September of 2011. I am going to talk about that in some detail. But first, I want to make sure everybody in this room understands why we're talking about removing a dam. In my experience, that is crazy talk to a whole lot of people. And so I want to just make sure that we understand, that the room understands why this is done and that it is, in fact, done on a fairly routine basis. Across the nation, according to the Army Corps National Inventory of Dams, there's roughly 76,000 dams in the U.S. And I don't have a mic. Is that troubling anybody?
Yeah.
Should I have a mic?
Please.
Okay.
Just for the official record.
Sorry. Are we good? Okay, great. So roughly 76,000 dams in the U.S., and that depends on who you ask. In this case, that, as I mentioned, is the National Inventory of Dams, which it is widely known misses a whole bunch of dams. That's because they have to set standards. They can't go out and count every single obstruction in rivers across the country. So that number is likely much, much higher, depending on your definition of what a dam is. In North Carolina, the North Carolina Dam Safety recognizes 5,424 as of maybe 2009 inventory. So there's quite a number of structures here in North Carolina. Of those 5,000 plus dams here, roughly 87% of those are privately owned. 62% of those are considered to have no use, or that use is limited to recreation only. So it's not a water storage for drinking water, it's not hydroelectric and the like, flood control, that kind of thing. And then also just a little stat for those who are curious, roughly 250 regulated dams per dam safety employee. So in other words, that's quite the job that our state dam safety inspectors have. That's quite a few dams that they need to go around and see. This is provided by American Rivers. Thanks to Lynette back. This is just a representation of where these dams are in the state. Those are the red dots. The yellow dots are known obstructions, or as they call them, aquatic obstruction inventories. And my understanding of that is basically a barrier to aquatic movement. And we'll talk a good bit about that here in a little bit in relation to Milburnie Dam. So why dam removal? And George brought this up earlier. This is Lowell. This was removed from the Little River in Johnston County, North Carolina back in 2005. First off, it takes an engineer to design a dam. And an engineer at this day and age puts a stamp on that design. And that engineer becomes liable for some period of time for the integrity of that structure, assuming it's built according to his or her standards. That is what we call the design life. How long does the engineer believe that structure is going to be sound? And that's usually somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50 years. So we have 76,000 dams in our country, some of which, according to the engineer stamp, shouldn't last beyond 50 years, according to his liability or her liability. So this is a figure produced by Martin Doyle and some other associates back in 2003, and basically what it represents is how many of those structures in the NID will be beyond their design life by 2020. And that's what you're seeing here. In North Carolina, roughly 72% of our structures will be, quote unquote, beyond their design life by 2020, just to give you perspective. So some of those dams age, some of those dams are subjected to events that they were not designed to withhold. And that happens. Mother Nature sends a lot of force and fury sometimes. In North Carolina, the best estimates I can get my hands on are roughly 6 dams a year fail. And it's usually during extreme events. To give you another indication, those of us that lived through Hurricane Floyd way back in the late 90s, 40 dams failed because of that event, and more than 100 others were overtopped, which means they were at risk of failure. So it does happen. Dams do fail. This is another slide from American Rivers. Basically, I present this just to give the audience some idea of how often dams are removed across the country. According to these data, roughly 1,000 dams have been removed as of this year. Not in 2012, but leading up to 2012. There's only 500 dots on the map here, but the number is closer to 1,000. So dam removal is not that infrequent. Excuse me. So now what I want to do is make sure everyone understands why we would remove a dam within the context of ecosystem restoration. And I think the best way to do that is for everyone to understand just how dramatic of a change a dam can make to a river ecosystem. And then you can start to understand the types of changes you would anticipate following dam removal. So what I have here is I will admit, a very extreme example when we're considering Milburnie Dam. This is Three Gorges Dam in the Yangtze in China. But the physical changes to rivers are similar. These are very similar processes. It's just a much more extreme example. Another one to look at, this is actually a rendition. This is not an actual dam. This is a rendition. But the idea that these large dams actually impound a whole heck of a lot of water. And I'm only showing these slides so that we can start to think, what are the physical changes that are going to happen to these river ecosystems once we dam them? One of the most obvious changes, and is really appropriate for Milburnie Dam, is that it can stop the migration of certain aquatic organisms, in this case, American shad. It's probably not an American shad, by the way. I'm not much of a biologist these days. Is that American shad? Hickory shad. That is American? Okay, good. Lucky me. So anyway, this species right here, in its migration, is being affected by the presence of Milburnie. And thanks to some of the work by Fish and Wildlife Service, amongst some other agencies, including, I believe, Army Corps to some extent, and certainly our Marine Corps helped us on a few of these removals. There's a handful of dams that have been removed in the Neuse Basin to date, which has allowed the migration of those shad to get all the way to Raleigh. So back in the late 90s, Fish and Wildlife helped remove 2 dams here, Quaker Neck and Cherry Hospital. Quaker Neck itself opened up the entire Neuse main stem all the way up to today's Milburnie Dam. Then on one of the major tributaries in the Neuse is the Little River. Rains Mill was removed in 1999 from the Little River. I believe Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, was actually at that removal. And the Marine Corps used a lot of TNT, and they removed it. Later, Restoration Systems ended up purchasing and removing Lowell Dam from the Little River as well. So collectively, what this has done is it's opened up miles and miles and miles of anadromous spawning habitat. And these fish, for those of you that aren't familiar with them, they're migratory fish. They're born in the freshwater, they make their way into the ocean, they travel across the Atlantic all the way up to the Bay of Fundy in Canada, and then come back home to Raleigh to lay their eggs again and spawn. So it's quite the journey, and these dam removals have opened up a lot of habitat, which hopefully will help them regain their numbers. So now this is just an illustration, very simplified illustration of what happens to a river when you put a dam in it. Just to orient everybody, blue line is the water surface, the brown is the river bed, and here's a cross-sectional representation. You build a dam, and you get some pretty dramatic shifts in the physical environment of that dam or that impoundment over time. What you see is that the water goes from shallow and relatively swift to slow and deep. And what usually happens is you start to accumulate sediments. And there's all kinds of other effects, which I'm going to go through now. So once that dam is built, it produces the slower, deeper flows, which my illustration just showed. It is now affecting habitat. Because it's gone from shallow, swift water to slow, deep water, there are a whole suite of organisms that were adapted to live in that river that now have to find somewhere else to go. If they survive, they either go upstream or they go downstream, where they can find shallow, swift water again. So what it does is it displaces those native aquatic organisms. And it oftentimes supports non-natives. Not all the time, but oftentimes does. So what you see are those shallow, swift water organisms are now pushed away, and you start getting more deep water, lentic types of organisms. And in addition, we talked a little bit about this with the fish migrations. It can also fragment habitat. So it doesn't just block anadromous fish. It can also take, in the case of, say, a rare species, it can isolate two populations. And they can no longer intermingle, except for very rare occasions does it happen. So it does have some effects on those rare populations as well. Another ecosystem function, if you will, or characteristic that it alters is light availability, which is incredibly important in freshwater ecosystems. So think about it again. You went from shallow, swift water, where the sunlight could easily penetrate all the way down to the river bed. And now you've replaced it with deep, slow water, and oftentimes the light doesn't penetrate all the way to the river bed anymore. And what it does is it makes it halfway down, let's say. And that affects several things. Most importantly, you've now shifted the aquatic food chain, if you will, of that system. It's gone from a system where organisms would forage, if you will, off of large algae that grows on the riverbed, and it's now a phytoplankton-dominated system, microscopic algae that float in the water. Oftentimes, if there's not enough flow through those systems, and you see this a lot in dams like Milburnie, and these dams that can trap water for long periods of time, only the surface water exchanges, the very tip top, exchanges with the overlying atmosphere to get oxygen. The bottom of that water often becomes what we call anoxic, or there's no oxygen at all. So any of those aquatic organisms that are in that part of the water column are, of course, stressed. And then the obvious factor, dams reduce the transport of materials downstream. And that's sediment is what that is. And sometimes people think of that as a good thing, and it can be. But oftentimes it's a bad thing because that's what forms habitat for downstream organisms. And it oftentimes leads to erosion downstream as well because the water that flows over these dams is sediment starved. It has a lot of energy once it finally leaves the impoundment and it starts to collect sediment from wherever it can, usually banks and beds. What's the advantage of dam removal in the context of ecosystem restoration is it's one of the few examples where we as restoration practitioners can identify the problem and can fix the problem. Versus some of the other fields of ecosystem restoration, we recognize that problems are too diffuse to be fixed by themselves. For example, we know that the more rooftops we put in watersheds and the more curbs and the more streets, that increases the runoff and decreases or degrades water quality. And so a lot of these rivers and streams are affected by what happens inside the watershed. And we can't fix that. We're not going to take all the houses down. We can't pull up all the pavement. But in the case of dams, we do have an opportunity to remove a discrete stressor from an ecosystem. And as I was hopefully making the case earlier, those stressors are related to the physical changes in the river themselves. What I mean by that is it is the presence of the dam that has led to the degradation of that impoundment. So if you remove the dam, you should see unequivocal and fairly swift responses within the ecosystem. You go from, if you will, allow me to use the term, an unnatural lake back to a natural river. And what you'll see are quickly shallower, swifter flows. You'll start seeing sediments moving through the system again. You'll see greater light availability on the riverbed. You'll have relief of fragmentation. In other words, those migratory fish can swim a little further upstream. Those two isolated populations of some rare shiner, let's say, can now intermingle much more freely. And you reestablish natural habitat for, in the case of Milburnie, roughly 6 miles. And that's just by removing the dam. There's a lot of literature out there, and I'm not gonna bore you with that right now, but I do want you just to see a visual effect. There's a handful of publications, and I'll be glad to share those with anyone who's interested. Please contact me. I can load up your inbox with studies that look at the ecological effects and benefits of dam removal. Obviously, don't expect you to read this because you couldn't if you tried. But what this is this is the guidelines for mitigation bankers when they want to remove a dam for a compensatory mitigation project or mitigation bank. The government got together, the IRT, that's the Army Corps, the EPA, Fish and Wildlife, and a slew of state agencies, Wildlife Resource Commission. Sure, I'm missing them all. But those are the usual suspects in the IRT. They collectively got together and put this guidance out there that says, if you want a mitigation bank, and you want to remove a dam to get one, this is how you do it, and this is how we evaluate the success of that project. One thing I don't know that we've talked about today is that each mitigation bank, it earns credits if it does its job right. If it meets its expectations, credits are then released by the federal government to the mitigation banker, and then the mitigation banker has the opportunity to sell those credits on the open market. Now, those credits aren't released at once. They're released according to a schedule, and that schedule is at least 5 years long. And why I want to make that important distinction now is that if a mitigation banker pursues a project and fails to deliver the results as required by their MBI, their mitigation banking instrument, they do not get credits. And if they don't get credits, they don't get revenue from the project. So the project needs to be done carefully, and the project needs to meet its established success criteria. So I'm going to talk about monitoring here in a little bit. And that's why we monitor these projects, is to determine, did it meet its ecological goals or not? So that document basically allowed restoration systems to use a couple of dam removals in the past to generate mitigation credits, and of course now to propose Milburnie to generate mitigation credits. Now each dam removal is complex, and as Gene and John both noted, this one in particular is no exception to that rule. In fact, it may very well be more complex than some of the other ones on that list that George showed us. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. So whenever I'm asked to assist someone with a dam removal, there's two questions for me right off the bat. What's the sediment story look like? And what's going to happen to the floodplain? And then the third question after the second question is answered is usually, are there wetlands on the floodplain? Because that's a pretty big deal. So what I want to walk you through here is in the document, and it's what I call the red flag survey, which is, okay, what are the potential problems should we remove this dam? And what's the degree that we should expect these problems to manifest themselves if they in fact will or do? First is sediment, as I mentioned. I think a lot of people, perhaps in this room, feel like, oh, you're going to remove a dam. Well, obviously, there's going to be tons and tons of sediment. You're just going to let that go downstream. Dams, especially like Milburnie, are not necessarily that efficient at trapping sediment. But you have to ask the question, and you have to answer the question before you can move forward. And that's exactly what we did in the case of Milburnie. What I did when I was here in 2009 is surveyed the river, the impoundment, and a few miles above and a few miles below to get an idea of what kind of sediment moves through this system, where is it depositing, and then, qualitatively speaking, how much of it is there. And that's always a good question to ask with a dam removal. To my surprise, what I found was that in the channel itself was mostly sand, which is a good thing from a water quality perspective, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But it's mostly sand, and it wasn't actually a whole heck of a lot of it. So then I dug as deep as I could to try to find, okay, fine sediments are really our concern when it comes to water quality problems downstream. And the reason why that is fine sediments, geologically speaking, have a lot of surface area. And they also have the ability to bind chemicals that you don't want in the water column, like heavy metals, PCBs, something that you might find, hydrocarbons, you might find in a watershed that had an industrial history. This one certainly fits into that category. So the first question I ask is, okay, fines. That's what I call the small sediments, the clays, the silts. Where are they? Are they likely to move if we remove this dam? And if the answer is yes, there's lots and they're likely to move, then we've got an issue that we have to talk about. And that probably would price somebody out of removing the dam. What we found was that most of the fine sediments are located in floodplain areas. Here's an example here. That's an open water area. Hedingham, green space over here, and in this wetland over here. We found 3 accumulations inside the active channel itself, here, here, and here. And they were modest accumulations, and they were isolated from one another. So it wasn't one consistent fine sediment wedge that went for a quarter mile. It was a couple of spots, 3 of them to be exact. So that was my conclusion. And I then started working with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Oh wow, that would have been, I guess, back in 2009. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, under the leadership of Dr. Tom Augsburger, a great guy who will willingly take a phone call if you have questions, he had already determined in a previous study, which I want to say, Mike, do you have any idea when that study was? 06, 03? Sometime, sometime around that general area. He figured out that there are a few dams in the Neuse Basin, close to Raleigh, that should they ever be removed, need to undergo some pretty serious chemical scrutiny of the sediments, just to make sure that we're not going to send PCBs, other hydrocarbons, and heavy metals downstream. So, Milburnie Dam was identified in that what we call the Tier 1 assessment. That was one of the 5 dams in the Neuse Basin that was identified as requiring the next level of due diligence, if you will. And I participated in that effort. Again, led by the Fish and Wildlife Service, Dr. Tom Augsburger. Dr. Augsburger and an associate went out to the impoundment, resurveyed the impoundment looking for fine sediment accumulations. They had my report. They went and verified that where I said there were fine sediments, there were fine sediments, and they looked for additional accumulations just to make sure that I didn't miss anything. And they actually didn't find anything else. But they agreed with my written assessment for the character of the sediment deposition behind this dam. The next thing we did, once we re-identified those locations, marked them with the GPS, went back out there on another day and using very painstaking aseptic techniques. What I mean by that is we had to carefully decontaminate every sampling instrument we used. And we went to all those locations and took multiple samples from each of those locations and made sure that we rinsed all the equipment and acid washed it in between sampling, so that if we found an area that was contaminated eventually with heavy metals, we weren't confused by where that location was in the river. We knew with confidence that because the instruments were routinely washed, we knew exactly where a problem was should we find one. So we took multiple samples at Restoration Systems' expense. We sent it to a USGS lab in Missouri where they analyzed it for various hydrocarbons and various heavy metals. And the results are on Raleigh's Fish and Wildlife page. And this is just a fact sheet from that particular Tier 2 assessment. And I'll show you the point that matters right here. Our final report demonstrates that concentrations of heavy metals and hydrocarbons and surface sediments upstream of the dam are below levels of concern. In other words, the Fish and Wildlife Service is comfortable. Its lead toxicologist, Dr. Tom Augsburger, feels like those sediments, if they move downstream, will not harm aquatic life downstream. So that's a major hurdle for this project. And it's a major hurdle for many dam removals. That's just, for a guy like me, you can wipe the brow. Okay, we don't have a whole heck of a lot of fine sediments in there, and the fine sediments we do have aren't covered in PCBs or some other terrible chemical that's going to cause problems. The next red flag, if you will, or potential red flag, is are rather all the wetlands located in the floodplain for the entire length of this impoundment. This impoundment is roughly 6 miles. And the first time I was asked to look at this dam, the first thing I did was I went to the aerial imagery. And lo and behold, what I saw was a lot of water outside the channel. And of course, wow, man, my first instinct was, we need to make sure that, there's not a connection between all these wetlands and that channel. Because if there's a hydrological connection between the wetlands and the channel, and you remove the dam and you lower the water, you're going to affect wetlands if that is the case. So what I did was I identified every wetland I could find using aerial photography along the floodplains of the river. And I floated all the way from 401 Bridge down through the impoundment all the way back to the dam. And I had, each location in a GPS, and I investigated every wetland that I identified in the aerial photography, plus any other wetland that I may have come across while it's out there. And I tried to determine if there was a visible nexus, as we call it, or a connection between the floodplain wetland and the channel. And you can use your eyes and tell if what we call the head or the water level in that wetland is at a different level than the river. And that is just a visual survey, is all I did. It's a very preliminary type of investigation. And I determined, the best of my ability, I only saw 3 connections, direct connections with the river. And those connections were down here, and I'll show you on another slide for better information. Right here by Beaver Dam Lake, over here by Headingham, and across the channel of Headingham on the opposite bank. Those were direct connections where you could clearly tell that as the water level in the river went up, the water level in the wetland went up. If the water level in the river went down, the water level in the wetland also went down. Then Restoration Systems asked Katina, in particular Mike Wood and some of his associates, to delineate all of the wetlands within the floodplain in that impounded reach of Milburnie. And whilst out there, determine if there's a direct connection, a surface water connection with these wetlands. And determine what actually controls the water level in these wetlands the best that they could. The results of their work corroborated the results of my work, which was what we saw, collectively now, 2 different entities saw, were natural levees running the length of the river that creates a separation between the river channel and those wetlands. Not in all cases, but in the vast majority of cases. And that there was water coming from upslope that is then trapped by those levees. Any breaks in those levees, for the most part, and there were a few, were impounded by beaver dams. So there was another connection. And then in a few other cases, the city of Raleigh maintains a sewer line, and the city of Raleigh maintains the grade of that sewer line. What I mean by that is if there's any hot spot of erosion along that line, they come out with gravel, and they make sure that that erosion goes away. So there were maybe 2 wetlands that seemed to be controlled more by the presence of gravel put down by the city of Raleigh than anything else. So they delineated those wetlands and agreed with me that there were 3 of concern, direct connections. This here is actually, this section here is actually not a wetland, it's open water, which just means there's not a whole lot of aquatic vegetation, if any, and it is just that, open water. And then here's the section adjacent to the Headingham neighborhood, and this section directly across the channel from Headingham. We then asked our engineer partners, Carno Entrix, to look into these particular areas and help us better understand what is going to happen there once the dam is removed. Because we now believe that those are the areas that are going to be affected by the dam's removal. What they came up with is this figure, just to summarize it. And what it shows are wetland losses and wetland gains. What we expect to see, these bright green lines are the existing boundaries, roughly, of those wetlands. And the solid green with stripes there is what we expect the wetland to look like following complete removal of the dam. Up here, where you have this pink outline here, that's the open water area. It's not a wetland currently. But once the dam's removed, it's anticipated that will become a wetland following the dam's removal. So what we ended up seeing was some losses, some gains. That wasn't the end of the wetland story. I don't think the team was quite comfortable with, okay, I mean, I know what we saw, and I know what the results say, but there's got to be some way to get a little bit more surety, if I can use that word, more assurance, that those wetlands above Milburnie Dam aren't just there because Milburnie Dam is. The Katina group then went downstream of the dam and investigated wetlands and delineated wetlands within the floodplain of the Neuse downstream of the dam. And that's what you're seeing here in the red. So there's the dam, flows this direction. You can see a very similar arrangement of wetlands downstream of the dam as you see upstream of the dam. And that's encouraging if you're considering removing the dam, because it suggests that in that general area there's something else there that can explain the wetland presence. Again, the natural levees we noticed and the hydrology independent of the channels. Interestingly enough, there are more acres of wetlands per linear foot of river downstream of the dam than upstream of the dam. So this is a figure that sort of summarizes the existence of wetlands upstream and downstream of the dam. Here's the dam, and you just get a better idea. So you see the spacing, the shape, somewhat similar, and within the context of what's going to happen to the wetlands after the dam removal, should it take place, this is really encouraging stuff, because it suggests that the dams aren't just going to go away. I'm sorry, the wetlands aren't just going to go away. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about what we know about the Milburnie ecosystem, existing conditions and mitigation banking lingo. Just a brief summary. Katina, who does the biological work on the project, provided this slide for us. Basically, freshwater mussel abundance and species diversity is lower within the impoundment than both upstream and downstream reference sites. It's a good opportunity for me to talk about reference sites briefly. The monitoring design here is going to be, we know where, if you're a scientist, we know where the experiment's going to take place, right? It's going to take place at Milburnie Dam, plus that entire impoundment that the dam now creates. So we use what we call reference sites so that we can judge the change in that ecosystem over time. And reference sites are sites that are also in the Neuse River, but they're outside of the influence of that dam. So there's a few sites upstream of the impoundment, and there's a few sites downstream of the impoundment. So all the impoundment's results in baseline and in the future will be compared to those reference sites over time. So what Katina noted was that in the impoundment, the diversity and the abundance is lower than both the upstream and downstream reference sites. They also noted that in terms of habitat, in the impoundment, it is limited to a very narrow section along the banks, basically the shallower portions of the channel. That's where the habitat is currently available, which, as you can imagine, creates a large void where they cannot inhabit. Other aquatic fauna, the existing dam is known, obviously, as a barrier to American shad and striped bass. We talked about that. The fish community within the impoundment is pretty much what you expect out of a lake, not out of a river. I'm not going to speculate on species. I'll leave that to Tim if you have questions. And then upstream and downstream of those unimpounded reaches is what you would expect to see. Again, those are free-flowing reference sites, relatively free-flowing reference sites. And why I say relatively is that we do have falls of the lake. So it's a regulated system, but that is shallow, swift water, very different than the impoundment. And what we found is that we saw the species we expected to see in the upstream and downstream reference reaches, river species. Another metric we'll look at is habitat and water quality as well. This is going to be done by our friends at Atkins. And they have done a good bit of work looking at cross sections in the river, again, within the impoundment and upstream and downstream reference reaches to characterize the habitat. What they found were that in the impoundment, you basically have a long, homogeneous, deep water pool for all intents and purposes, one single type of habitat for about 6 miles. So no ripples, the water is deep, it lacks any habitat diversity. Stream velocity, as you would expect, water depths below the dam height are stagnant. Sediment size is not really diverse, it's fairly uniform. What that means is you pretty much have a very similar size grain of sand from the top to the bottom of the impoundment. The aquatic habitat has multiple habitats are missing in terms of riffles, leafbacks, rocks, slow banks. Benthic macroinvertebrates, for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, those are basically the stream bugs. Those are the little critters that crawl across the rocks in the riverbed. And what you see there is that several feeding guilds are low in numbers and habitat is missing or not ideal. And what that really means is that you don't see the types of river bugs, if you will, that you would expect to see in swift water or free-flowing river conditions. Instead, you see those you would expect to see in a lake. The fish community, the dam is a barrier and habitat is missing or not ideal for river-adapted species. The mussel community, same story there. And water quality, what we found was dissolved oxygen and temperature, they are connected. It's a physical process. Typically what happens is, as the water gets warmer, it is less capable of holding on to dissolved gases. That's just a common principle. So if it's slow and it's deep, the surface layer tends to get warm because it's exposed to sunlight for longer periods of time. And then, ultimately, where the sun, if it's deep enough, the sun can't penetrate all the way down. So the bottom water gets really cold. The warm water stays really hot. And the two don't mix. They're, for all intents and purposes, are isolated. And so what you see is in the top, you get a good bit of oxygen at the very top of the water surface. But everything that's down below that, all the oxygen is consumed and it's just never really replenished during the warmer months. So what they found was low levels of dissolved oxygen, which was associated with temperatures as we expected. And that can, of course, stress aquatic communities. So that gives you a concept of, or hopefully I gave you a concept of what that ecosystem looks like today. And we talked a little bit about, okay, the effects that dams have on ecosystems, and those results match expectations. Quite frankly, we expected to get what we got from those baseline conditions. So now, what do we expect should this project be permitted and the dam is removed? In terms of water quality, the velocity is going to pick up. It's going to become a shallower system again. So there's going to be a lot of exchange with the atmosphere, and there will be less time for the water to be warmed in the sun, if you will. So what we'll see is a decrease in temperature and an increase in dissolved oxygen, which is good for healthy aquatic ecosystems. Should also see the appropriate river bugs coming into new habitat. Same with the fish, same with the mussels and the snails. And basically that has to do with habitat. We're going to go from a simple, single pool that stretches for 6 miles to a complex of various types of habitat. There'll be riffles, there'll be smaller pools, there'll be runs, and that will allow a whole suite of native species to recolonize the site. And then finally, what we hope to see is the recolonization of this site by some rare species. We know that some exist, and Tim can talk a lot more about this than I can. We know some of these rare species are found downstream of the dam and upstream of the dam and not within the impoundment. So they're isolated, they're disconnected, and that all has to do with the physical structure of this river. It's a lake, and these rare species aren't adapted to lakes, they're adapted to rivers. So you bring the river back and you have a really good shot at bringing those species back. And I don't just say that in hopes of this working out. I say it because I've seen it happen. It happened at Carbonton and it happened at Lowell. And those are 2 dam removals that also happened because of restoration systems. So we had a federal listed species at Carbonton that recolonized how many miles of river?
27. 20,
well,
28.
10 was the impoundment, so yeah, so about 10 miles of river and several
trips
as well, a few miles of trips. And then a few state protected mussels in Lowell were documented at Lowell following the removal. So there's reason for these expectations. We've seen this happen. We've seen it happen here in North Carolina, and then if you go through the literature and you talk to the experts, they've seen it happen elsewhere. So just briefly, here are the responses we expect to see. Freshwater mussels, we expect their numbers to go up in the old impoundment. Again, we're putting the habitat back in place, so they should colonize the site. The anadromous fish, once you remove the blockage, you should see the fish swim upstream. And I mean, that certainly was the case with Quaker Neck, because you couldn't fish for shad in Raleigh for several years until Quaker Neck was removed. And now you can go to Milburnie and you can catch them there. Resident fish, those are the local native adapted fish that are adapted to rivers. They should come back as well and displace the fish that are more lake adapted. And then this is habitat stuff and water quality stuff. Hey, what I'll move on through that because I feel like we've pretty much hit that. But those are the changes we expect to see. New habitat, reestablishment of habitat, and once that is in place, you should see a reestablishment of the native biology. So now let's talk about how this dam would come out if it does. I think it's a very important thing to discuss. It's an important process for those that are trying to conceive what it is that's being permitted here and how the action will be carried out. Okay, you remember our red flag survey discussion. We basically had two that are of potential concern. We know that there are wetlands in these floodplains, and we know that there are sediments. Now, the sediments aren't toxic. There aren't a lot of those sediments, but that doesn't mean that we can't control the rate at which those sediments are released downstream. The good news is, if we can control the sediments and how they're released downstream, we can also control the rate at which this system adjusts to a new water level. And that's important for bank stability, and it's important for those wetlands as well. So the way to do that, again, back to this schematic, this is just a general representation of how reservoirs sediment, and it's actually a little bit simplified. We have at the top of these impoundments is what we call the coarse sediment delta. That's, think of a river, it's free flowing, it has all this energy, it carries, in some cases, gravel and sand, and then all of a sudden it reaches the impoundment, which means that the river gets wider, it gets deeper. So ultimately what happens is the river flow is losing energy. And when it loses energy, it can no longer carry the material it was carrying when it entered the impoundment. So the heavy stuff drops out first. It's what we call the coarse sediment delta. And this cross-section just gives you an idea of what it might look like. Then as you get to the middle of the impoundment, you start getting some of the finer, not the finest, but some of the finer sediments dropping out in the middle of the impoundment. And then finally, the finer stuff drops out in this area here, right up against the dam usually. That's what we call the fine lake deposits. And just to give you an idea, and again, this is not Milburnie data, this is very general stuff. In fact, it comes out of the textbook for reservoir sedimentation handbook. And I just recreated it. And what you see is that, these fine deposits get a little bit more concentrated as you get closer to the proximity of the dam. And remember, the dam is what's affecting the energy in the system, and that change in energy is what leads to sedimentation. So, what do we do in order to remove the dam and control the rate at which those sediments move downstream? To use a very technical term, you give it a series of haircuts. And this is what I'm proposing. Basically, you dewater it first. And what I mean by dewater is the dam is still in place, but you come up with some way of releasing some of the water that's behind the dam. And that's important for two reasons. One is you want to expose some of those floodplain areas, and you want to do it in a very gradual process. What you don't want to do is what we call the old blow and go method in the business, and that is where you take a dam that is full of water, full of sediment, you strap a bunch of TNT on it, and you let it go. What happens there is that's a lot of potential energy. It is tons of water and tons of sediment, and then all of a sudden what you've done is you've changed the slope of the river from this to this. And all that water and all that sediment is just going to go barreling downstream. We don't want that to happen. So the first step is what we call dewatering. I don't know exactly how we're going to do it. That's part of the design process. And as a reminder, we're in the preliminary stages here, so we don't have the engineering design. But there are a couple ways to go about it. You can put a simple notch in the dam. You might open up gates on the hydroelectric facility, or you might even create a bypass channel. and you control the elevation of that channel so only the topmost water goes through that channel and then down back into the noose. And so what you end up doing is you just relieve some of the water behind the dam. And the real idea there is to take some of those wetland areas and take some of those open water areas and allow them to slowly draw that water down so we don't have erosion problems there. Give them time to adjust, give the plants time to grow, and then when we all think it's time and we're ready, you go for the haircut approach. And that is, you take the top off the dam. And what you end up doing when you take the top off the dam is you're changing the reservoir's capacity to store sediment and water. Not completely. Again, we didn't blow and go. It's not just some plume of sediment going downstream, but you've very gradually reduced its ability to hold on to that sediment that it's held on to for the last 150 years. Not by a whole heck of a lot, but by some. And so the next time Falls Lake releases a good flow, it'll pick up some of that sediment, but not all of it, and it'll move it downstream. And then we come in later, and we give it another haircut, and again, you reduce the capacity of the reservoir to hold on to those sediments, allowing some, but not all, to move downstream in a more controlled manner. And then finally, for a third stage of lowering, you reduce the capacity again, and then you come in for a fourth time, and you completely remove the dam. And you get back the slope that the Neuse River had 150 years ago. That's the concept. Okay, I apologize for a black and white slide, but at last minute addition, I wanted to throw this in. This is from Lowell Mill, Little River, Johnson County. This is an image before the dam was removed. And I don't know how easy it is for you guys to see this, but there's the river channel right here, and that's an impoundment. And I want you to notice this area here and this area here. Those are floodplain areas full of water. Not dissimilar to that area right next to Headingham, and not dissimilar to that area just below Beaver Dam Lake. Okay, so just want to show you some similarities here. So once the dam at Lowell was dewatered, a lot of that floodplain water, or a lot of that water stored in those floodplain areas, poured into the channel, and went on down the Little River. And again, that was a staged removal. So there wasn't a whole heck of a lot of erosion that took place because they didn't drastically change the slope in the river quickly. So again, they limited the change in energy that took place. So this is what one of those areas looked like. Open water, 3, 4, 5 feet deep, depending on where you are. And this is from some of my research back in my dissertation days. This was February, roughly, of 2005. And you can see, just for perspective, there's a canoe and there's a person standing right next to the canoe. So, water about up to my waist. And then I'm probably in about 2 feet of muck. So maybe water really was only up to here. Then the impoundment was dewatered. This is 2 days after it was dewatered. Again, it wasn't a blow and go situation and all the water rushed out at once. It was a slow drawdown. And this is what it looked like. A mud flat. And this is exactly what I would expect to see, especially below Beaver Lake Dam. It will probably be a mud flat. And that's not the prettiest sight, I have to admit. But stick with me and watch the rest of these pictures, which is a time series. So that was April 28th. This is June 6th. It greened up in a matter of weeks. And it was amazing just how quickly it got green. This is July 13th. This is 6 weeks later. And this is roughly 4 months after the dam was dewatered. So I expect this to happen at Milburnie. And I expect this to happen in those open water floodplain areas. And that's a good thing. That right there is a very, very thick mat of vegetation that is tying up the sediments so they don't move downstream. It's also tying up a lot of nutrients, and we are in the Neuse. So we are concerned about nitrogen and phosphorus moving downstream. So if we can control the dam's removal in such a fashion as to facilitate this type of growth in the floodplain, a lot of your erosion concerns go away. So now I'll talk briefly about the monitoring plan. Again, remember, this is a mitigation bank, and in order for credits to be released, there has to be a demonstration of ecological success. Again, that's the document that leads, is the guidance for the monitoring plan. And ultimately, these are the things that will be monitored. Anadromous fish passage, appropriate aquatic community, that's river-like species as opposed to lake species. Water quality, again, temperature, dissolved oxygen. And rare and protected species. In general, it'll be an annual monitoring program, so there'll be an extensive effort by both Atkins and Katina to go out there and figure out exactly how the system is changing over time. And then again, comparing that to reference reaches. A report will be generated, submitted to the Army Corps, and those results are then used to determine, hey, did this project demonstrate ecological success or not? And just to reiterate it, success does equal credits for this project. Real quickly, this is the stuff, we pretty much talked about it already, but again, for water quality, dissolved oxygen, temperature, benthics, or those river bugs, I talked about it. That also can be used for water quality. They have something called the EPT, and what they do is they go out and they pick these bugs up and they classify them, and then there's just known relations with water quality and these particular organisms. So you find some that are more sensitive than others, and that helps guide some of the determinations in water quality. Here a map of the locations for sampling stations. Basically, that red line is the impoundment today. And those blue stations are sampling stations within the impoundment. Here are references upstream, references downstream. That's for water quality. In terms of the habitat, that will be basically characterizing the physical channel itself. What's the geometry of the channel? What's the velocity of the river within the channel? What's the sediment character? What are the feature types, as we call them, pools, riffles, runs, that kind of stuff. And then we'll use this to judge what type of community we should see. And here are the sampling stations for that. Again, reference reaches upstream. Red line being the impoundment, blue stations being the impoundment stations, and then a suite of references downstream. Biological surveys done by Katina Group. Very similar setup. You see reference reaches up here, the green stations in the impoundment, and then I believe there's a reference station down here. There's two of them, looks like. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Okay, and basically we talked about this, so I think I accidentally have the slide in twice, so we'll move on. The anadromous fish passage, that's pretty simple stuff. Not to undermine the hard work that Tim does with his fishing rod at the base of Falls Lake Dam, but should the dam be removed, that's how we'll know. I mean, if we catch fish all the way up at Falls Lake, that's a success. I mean, that's 15 miles of river that has been opened up and is now available for these fish to come back home and roost, so to speak. Additional monitoring. Okay, the wetlands are still there. If all goes well, the wetlands are still there, but we need to make sure of that. And so Restoration Systems has agreed to monitor the wetland hydrology within the impoundment. And has also agreed, let me back up, to monitor the floodplain vegetation, just to make sure that we get the kind of robust revegetation we expect to see. If we don't, we're going to help it along. Because keep in mind, we want to keep those fine sediments in the floodplain in place. That's our goal. So this is a map. You've seen it already, but what you looked at were the delineations of those wetlands, the red areas. These yellow dots are groundwater wells that Katina put in. They're in there now. And Katina is monitoring the hydrology of these wetlands today. And we will continue to monitor that for the life of the project. And the goal there is to understand if there have been unanticipated losses to those wetlands following the dam's removal. So with that, I'm done, believe it or not. I know it felt like it would go on forever, and it probably did.
Maybe we can open up for
But we would like to get Matt up here, I believe, to introduce the next speaker.
And our final two speakers tonight are actually owners of the Milburnie Dam. We have Jennifer Twiggs and Margaret Miller. So Jennifer, do you want to come up first?
Sure. And I'm very brief. I know you guys want this question, so this is very brief. I don't do this anymore.
Oh, okay.
I have an extraction for this, so I'm sorry I have to cough. And I want to thank everybody for their patience and for all the hard work, the incredible hard work you guys have done. The one thing I'm taking away from this is that I could never do what you do, and I could never do what the Army Corps of Engineers do, because I would never be able to hang with it that long. So I'm here as a representative of the Twiggs family. We are the private owners of the Milburnie Dam and the surrounding property. I'm the third daughter of the late Howard Twiggs, who, along with his sister Carolyn, were the sole owners of the property. It was passed down to them by their father, who died when my father was a teenager. When my father died, his share was passed to myself and my sisters. My father loved this property. He loved this property. He spent a lot of time there with his father. He took me there to cut down Christmas trees. He loved this. I could even see him getting nostalgic when we walked the property. He really felt connected to it. In the history of my family, this property has seen many changes. It was a mill for a while, and during my dad's time, it was in the mill for a while during my dad's time, and it produced hydroelectric energy for a brief period, and most recently, the city of Raleigh has put a greenway on it. I wish my father had been alive to see the greenway. It's something he would have absolutely supported. He spent his life working for the public good, and I think he would have been thrilled to see the greenway there. This property has changed purposes over time. This property has been a source of joy, a source of income, a source for solace, a source for Christmas trees, and in recent times it's also been a source for worry, concern, and liability. My father passed away suddenly and unexpectedly on March 4th of 2010. For years prior to his death, he had been working to find a solution to his concerns. The hydroelectric plant was a financial failure, and there was old decaying equipment left behind. After a drowning occurred there, not the one just recently, but further back, he was devastated, and he became intensely concerned about the dangers associated with the dam. He also worried about the aging structure of the dam and the high cost of maintenance for the dam. Additionally, my father had a case in his law practice where he represented the river keepers for 5 rivers in the state of North Carolina. Through that research that he did for the case, he became keenly interested in the environmental health of rivers and the environmental importance of free-flowing water, and also nitrogen and all some of the things they talked about and how it affected humans, because people can get sick when there's too much of that stuff in the water. He began to see that the dam that he owned was an impediment to the health of the Neuse River. My father worked all of his life to be a good citizen for this earth. As a member of the North Carolina House of Representatives, he was instrumental in creating the North Carolina Zoological Park. I won't list all the things he did, but he accomplished a lot of things for the state and for the city of Raleigh. He fought hard for it. He fought hard on many fronts to protect the public from harm. My dad was an early conservationist. He was a humanist. He was not a man who made rash decisions. When he teamed up with our systems, he felt that he had found the perfect solution to his concerns about the dam. He, along with his sister, felt that the removal of the dam was the right thing to do for his city, for the environment, and financially for his family. I, as his daughter, am left with the task of helping to fulfill my father's last wishes. My sisters and I feel that it is our duty to complete the work he did to get the dam removed. As they mentioned, my dad worked for 2 years or so with these guys and then died suddenly. They were this close to getting everything finalized. It was my father's desire to ease the burdens associated with the dam. With the new greenway now in place, if anything, our concerns regarding liability have increased. The greenway will bring more people within close proximity to our property, and therefore, the possibility of trespassers increases. This increases the possibility that someone might get injured or drown. To help with the healthy restorative flow of the Neuse River, my dad wanted to remove the dam, and so do we. For kayakers, canoers, fishermen, river keepers, and lovers of nature, we want the dam removed. Last, my father wanted to leave a financial legacy for his children and grandchildren. The removal of the dam does all of these things. We have a private company working with private owners, working towards something for the public good. And it is absolutely my wish to help my dad's wishes be fulfilled. Thank you.
My name is Margaret Miller. I'm the daughter of Carolyn Fox, who is the sister of Howard Twiggs. And Jennifer said everything pretty much I was going to say, so I'll even be briefer. Just to let you know, my mom adored the place too. She loved growing up, going out there with friends. The only thing she didn't like was my grandfather apparently had a goat that was there to take care of the trash and the weeds and everything that would chase them around. But otherwise, she loved it out there, and she has very fond memories. My husband and I took her out there, I think early spring, early summer, I think, just to let her see it again, and she just told us stories about it, and she really did like it. She has become very concerned about the liability of it. She also was devastated to hear of the drownings that have been out there, and it breaks her heart. She's been prepared with my uncle to take it down, to have it removed, mainly for those reasons. Financially, she's 84. She's had a lung taken out. She's had breast cancer. She could use the support if that's what happens. As far as her children, my sister-in-law is at a point where she can't work anymore. She has a disability. I don't know if you noticed, but my walking isn't graceful. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis almost 9 years ago. You never know what's going to happen with that. So for us, it would be a benefit that way. I love the idea of taking the dam down. Everything that you guys done, I had no idea you have done so much. Thank you so much for all your research and the years that you spent on this. It makes perfect sense to have it taken down to restore the dam, to restore the river the way it was before the dam was created. It served its usefulness. It was great for my grandfather. It was great for my uncle and my mom to work on the hydroelectric power plant. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The usefulness of the dam is done. I think it's ready for it to come down so that it can be back the way it was created. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we're ready to enter the question and answer portion of the evening. A couple of ground rules to set out is that when you checked in, we had people indicate if you wanted to ask a question. Now, obviously, maybe your question was answered, and if so, that's fine. You can just raise your hand and say, no problem, go to the next one. But we're going to take people, we're going to call people up to the microphone in the middle so that we can get this all on the record. We're going to call people up to the microphone in the middle in the order that you signed in, if you indicated you want to ask a question. Because we have so many folks who want to ask questions, we ask you to keep it to one question per person, and we ask you to limit your question to a minute or less. That's so that everyone can have an opportunity to ask. If we have additional time, once everybody has had an opportunity to ask a question, then we'll go back and you can ask a second question.
Is this considered an open forum? I mean, it seems to me like there's been several hours from one side and probably only a few minutes from the other side. That doesn't seem like quite equitable to me.
This is a public information workshop where we'll have an opportunity for folks like yourself to come up.
1 minute doesn't equal 3 hours or whatever. Why is that equitable?
Because the purpose of this is to learn more about what's going on with this proposal and where it stands in the process, and for you to raise questions that you might have.
And concerns?
Absolutely. All right, so we'll go ahead and begin. If at any point you have follow-up questions or don't feel like your question was adequately addressed, Lars, the person standing in the back, is ready to take your information, your complete question, and we will make sure that Restoration Systems or one of the experts gets back to you personally to address that question and make sure all of your concerns are addressed. So the first question comes from Bob Emanuel. Is Bob here?
Yes, I have no question. I defer to the others.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Emanuel. The next question is Michael Williams.
No question.
You guys are making this too easy. The next question is David Rhodes.
Yes, my name is David Rhodes.
Can you just come stand at the microphone? Thank you.
My name is David Rhodes, and I live here in Raleigh, in fact, very near Hedingham. And I was wondering about how long we should expect to see the benefits of, once the dam is removed. What is a time frame do you think that we might start to see the benefits of the dam removal?
Great. Adam, do you want to start? Thank you, David.
Am I on? Am I on? No? No. How about that?
Speak up.
I'm trying. Can y'all hear me now? Hey,
Yeah.
there we go. All right. Might be a PhD, but I can't operate a microphone. Answer to your question is it depends on what particular part of the ecosystem you're looking for a change in. Expect to see habitat start to shift as soon as water is released from behind the dam. And then once the habitat, and that will be an ongoing process. It'll happen a little bit more with each flow, each rain event or release from Falls Dam. It'll redistribute some of those sediments and into new forms and put them in new places. And that is the basis of most of the change you're going to see, because that will become the habitat that will then support the biology as it comes back into the impoundment. So it'll take some time, and I think that Tim and Matt here can expand on that a good bit. As far as water quality goes, that will be pretty instantaneous. Usually you don't have these water quality problems in the winter months. It's in the summer months. So if the dam is removed in fall, winter, come spring and summer, you won't have those issues anymore. Anybody else want to expand?
So with the dam removal projects that we've been involved in doing the monitoring of, as well as the literature on dam removal that exists throughout the country and the world, some of the fastest responders are those benthic macroinvertebrates. And why that's important is that those are going to be one of the essential bases of the food chain for the fishes, and birds and other things will come in there and be able to take advantage of some of the shallower habitats. And while they may not be eating the bugs directly, some of the smaller minnows will also be attracted to those birds. And so the benthic macroinvertebrates responding within the first season is something that we've seen in the past. And they don't get to their ultimate improvement in that first season, but you already see a dramatic shift because a lot of their lifespan is annual for some species, while it's several years for some of the longer live. But they'll be coming in and deposit the eggs, and as soon as the flowing water habitat is there in the riffles, which is one of the most rich habitats in a river ecosystem like that, you'll start to see the change that following spring. I'll let you go about fishing.
Yeah, but basically, I guess every dam removal is different, and different systems will respond at different rates. Our experience with the two that we've been involved with, Carbonton Dam and the Lowell Dam, the fish community response was fairly quick. Within the first year of monitoring, we saw improvement and continued to see improvement through the 5-year monitoring period. We didn't expect the mussels to show improvement very quickly, and that's mainly associated with their life cycle. They require a fish species to complete their life cycle. And they're not very mobile, so it takes them a while to populate new areas. However, with Carbonton, the mussel recovery was quite a lot quicker than we expected. By year 3, we were seeing rare species that weren't there before show up in low numbers in the former impoundment. With Lowell, that was a little slower, but we did see improvement by year 5 with the freshwater mussels.
Great. We good? Okay. The next question comes from Mr. Bob Davis.
Realizing that we're not talking about a specific point in time, but a range of time period, I'm just curious what kind of time frame we're talking about for the actual removal down the line.
Do you mean the deconstruction of the dam itself, or the time period from now to when it would be deconstructed?
I'd like to know when it'll be deconstructed. So I guess, yeah, how much longer are we looking at before it would actually happen?
Well, I'll just say that's kind of a permitting question in our business. That's always, an important question, and we've learned the hard way over the years that we don't count on things happening anytime soon. Okay, and as you can see, we're at a preliminary stage, and we've got 4 years into it. I would say most hopefully by next fall, most likely by the following fall.
Thank you. Jim Nelson is next.
I have several questions, but I'll start with one since that's what you said.
Thank you.
Just a simple one. How much will the water level in the river be reduced?
Great question, and as you can imagine, that's probably on a lot of people's minds, and I apologize for not including that information in the presentation. But for whatever reason, my 60 slides, I didn't have room for it. No, the answer is it depends, and I hate to be a broken record because that was the answer to my other question, or to the other question, but it depends on where you're looking in today's impoundment. You know, the dam, obviously it creates deep water, but the water gets deeper as you get closer to the dam. So there's quite a variation in the depth of that impoundment now. If you're at the very top of it, you know, it could be a foot or two right now. If you're at really close to the dam, it could be 8, 10 feet. So I think worst case scenario, you'll see an adjustment under normal flow conditions close to the dam of about 8 feet. Now, as you go upstream...
So the water by the dam will be 8 feet shallower?
That would be my expectation, yes. Now, as you go upstream, you're going to find much shallower areas and much deeper areas, depending on where you are, because what we'll see, pools will form and riffles will form, and so you'll see a lot of variation in depth.
How will that be conducive to canoeing and kayaking?
It should be okay. I've canoed the river both above the dam, you know, above the impoundment, I should say, and below the impoundment. And I think that for those that are curious and have access to the river, that's what I would encourage you to do. Put in above the impoundment, float to the impoundment, and get a sense for what that stretch of the river is like without a dam. Then once you get to the impoundment, you'll know it. It will change enough that, you know, it'll get slow, it'll get deep, it'll get a little wider. And then be very careful, portage around the dam, put in below it, and float a little further. And you'll get a sense of what, you know, it'll be different above it and below it. But it's a river above it and below it. And that should give you some sense of what to expect.
Thank you. Camille Warren.
Hi, I'm Camille Warren, and I'm a kayaker. I'm a member of 2 paddling clubs based here in the Triangle. And I did notice that one of the factors that are considered are recreational factors, and my interests are historical and recreational. I've done a lot of research on the web about the dam, and it's got some very interesting history. The original dam was built as an 8-foot timber dam before the Civil War, and then around 1900, the current granite block and masonry dam was built, you know, to a height of 16 feet supposedly. The granite blocks were locally quarried, and given that and the fact that the dam is so much a history of this area, I really feel like they belong to Raleigh and Wake County, and it would be really wonderful if the blocks would be donated to the city of Raleigh for it to use as it sees fit in the Milburnie Park that it will build someday. The other thing, as a paddler, I mean, I enjoy flatwater paddling and have enjoyed paddling the flatwater stretch above the dam, but I also do whitewater paddling and have enjoyed that. In some of the old historical references I have read about Milburnie Dam, some of the very old things I found referred to even older documents that talked about Milburnie Falls. And of course, we all know these dams that were built for power generation to run mills or whatever were often built at falls because they could take better advantage of the fall of the water. And there are places in the country where dams have been removed strategically in such a way as to create really nice whitewater features. And in fact, in San Marcos, Texas, dam removal was done in such a way that create this beautiful river park with whitewater features. And it would be, given the fact the dam is coming down, there's very likely some interesting natural whitewater features there. Nobody knows. It's been 150 years. It would just be a real shame to pass up the opportunity to take advantage of that using what's there and perhaps even some of the blocks to create a wonderful whitewater paddling location. And so that's not really a question.
No, but I think...
No, that's a fine comment, though. And I'm glad the Corps of Engineers was here to see it, that there's public support for doing that. You can imagine when we do that, it tends to just complicate the plan because we've got a particular objective we're trying to reach. But if it can enhance the plan and make it more attractive to have it removed and help please our regulators, then of course we would consider that. Now, we've already done a lot of work with Elizabeth Gardner of her club,
Right.
and actually going to be
And
contributors.
I belong to that club.
Yeah, and we're going to contribute to the Whitewater Park, and we're going to follow along. We feel like we're a part of that Rivers community. So whether we do something on the site, possibly as a result of your comment and the interest of the Corps, or whether we're working upstream with the paddling groups, that's one of our objectives. We want to make recreation better on the river, and very much appreciate your comment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Betty Rhodes is next.
I'm really concerned about the area around Hedingham, and that was answered for me.
Okay. Thank you. Ed Brandel.
Good evening. My name's Ed Brandel. I live in the Foxcroft subdivision. And like many others here, I feel like we're kind of being shortchanged by the brief time we can spend up here. I wanted to ask several things, but under the conditions that prevail, I don't think I can. I was asking one question I wanted to ask, though, and I had several, but
Mr. Brandel, please ask all the questions you like. We don't have as large a group as we might have thought. If you want to ask a couple of questions, we'll do it.
Well, that's good to know. Have you considered a fish ladder? Because there are several of us that would be glad to fund a fish ladder to begin with, if that was one of the main problems that you were facing and the reason you wanted to build the dam. I mean, take the dam down. Was it because of the shad going no further? They've come 120 miles. I don't think another 15 miles is going to make that much difference to the shad.
It likely, well, there are a couple of things going on. One, it's a little bit like putting dance shoes on a cow. You know, you've got an ugly, decrepit facility there. Well, ugly in some people's view, and others, but it's a decrepit facility which is continuing to degrade, continuing to get older, continuing to get less stable. And to take a very sophisticated thing like a fish ladder and make it an integral part of it is taking something that's very unstable and uncertain and putting a modern device on it, which seems unwise. Second, as an economic proposition, it might be a good idea if you get past those concerns, but that wouldn't produce the credit sufficient for us to probably either fund the fish ladder or make it worthwhile. We don't get the same number of credits for doing such an action as we would for what we're doing here.
I mean, I thought that was one of the main reasons, getting the shad a little further up the river and toward the dam.
It is. There are actually 4 different things we have to achieve to get the credits that we've defined. So if we only achieve that, it will be 1/4 of the value of the project.
Well, you know,
or even less.
I've been up down that river a lot of times in my boat and in those estuaries and so forth, the wetlands, and my opinion is that, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's a lot of wildlife in there that's going to be destroyed, just a lot of wildlife. And we had the opportunity to go down to the lake that Laura Dam, and let me tell you, those people down there, they're hot. I mean, I wouldn't even want y'all to go through that town now because they're hot. They didn't like the results of it at all. We went down there and walked up around the pond, I mean the lake, the river, that is, and you'd see tire over here and this and that and the other, and the mayor, they were just hot under the collar. I mean, they were just ready to boil over. And I'd hate to think that this would be left the same way. And who would clean up the debris upstream for the
Well, we're going to have to work with the agencies on that. There's always some concern. They consider the woody debris in there to be a benefit to wildlife. So we've got to be careful, but I think we can work out something where we can get passage through if there is an adequate passage. We don't know what it's going to look like yet. But nature will take care of it for one thing. The Lowell Dam has gotten nothing but better and better behind it. It gets continually cleans itself out in a natural manner, and I imagine this river system will do the same thing.
Well, I just know that there's a lot of junk been put. I fish the river a lot too. Mattress springs and VW motors and everything else are in there. So there's a lot to be considered in the cleanup if you go that route. I mean,
well, just remember, all that's in there right now. It would be an aesthetic thing to take it out because whatever environmental damage or toxic damage and that kind of stuff, that's going on right now. So this only gives us a chance to clean it up that we don't have while the dam's there.
So you would clean up you'd clean up everything that's exposed?
I can't commit to that now. I'm not going to commit to cleaning up everything that's exposed. If it's woody debris and that type stuff, but if there's an old Model T sitting out behind the dam, I guarantee you we'll drag it out.
Well, I guess you would, but and by the way, I want to say something to the people that are Howard's family. I knew Howard for 50 years, and he was a good man, and I appreciated him a lot. I was in JC's with him and so on, and I was with him about a week before he died, and I'm going to miss him. I know you do. I'll defer to the rest of the people. But I stay out of that area down there in the Laura Dam. It wouldn't be safe, I don't think. Boy, they were hot.
Take a look at the Carbonton Dam. It's a larger river and kind of more similar to this one. If you ever make it down there, it's only about a 45-minute drive, and it's quite attractive.
Thank you.
Next question is Mr. Bill Jones.
My question's been answered.
All right, thank you, sir. John Connors.
Hello, I'm John Connors, and as a wildlife biologist, I appreciate what you do. In this particular case, I have to admit I'm a little skeptical of the benefits, and here's why. We're trading ecosystems here, I think. So there is a functional, vibrant, as Ed said, wildlife-rich environment that's there right now, up above the dam. My concern is when we take the dam out, which I would normally support, the river system that's up above, from there to the Falls Lake Dam, that has, the city of Raleigh made a decision when we put Falls Lake Dam in to infill that floodplain, that watershed. And that is some of the heaviest neighborhood development that took place in Raleigh. So all the streams that we're talking about, a good percentage of them, like Perry Creek, which I'm very familiar with, these are highly impacted streams. And so sending the shad upstream to breed in these areas, is a little bit wishful, I think. I can defer to my friend Mike and Tim. Maybe you can tell me more to reassure me that this will actually work, that the shad will go up there and have success breeding. A measure of them making it to Falls Lake Dam is not a measure of success. It's a measure of success of the breeders surviving up to there, but we really should measure whether they successfully spawn and whether their young make it back downstream.
Well, you want me to?
Go ahead, take a shot.
Yeah, I think when they do the success criteria, they will be required to measure.
Mike, I'm sorry, introduce yourself.
I'm Mike Wicker with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I think when they will be required to show the reproductive product, little fish. And, so they'll be required to do that. I think if you look at most of these fish, the striped bass, the American shad, and then there's a couple species of sturgeon too, and the sturgeon, that we don't really know how far they go up, but they may go up there. And but if you look at the tail race of Falls Lake and look at the water coming over the lake, it's high DO, it's relative, it's fairly clear, it's good water quality. And I suspect the bulk of the actual productivity to augment the population will be proximate to Falls Lake. So the thing about these fish is that they have, very high fecundity. And, you might have one individual that has 500,000 or depending on the species, several 100,000 eggs. And so that's where I think the real benefit is going to be. Not so much up the tribs at all, but getting right in that clean water coming off the tail race of falls. And so, but you're right. And in the end of the day, what we really want to do is get these where people might be able to see a sturgeon in North Carolina. Most North Carolina natives have never seen one. They're seeing them back up in Richmond now. Where guys that have lived there for 40 years and they're seeing 6-foot sturgeon, swimming under the bridge. It's kind of neat.
Because of dam removal.
Well, because of habitat restoration. I think, they've done some spawning. And, they've done dam removal there too, but they've done a number of things there. So, that's what we're shooting for.
Is there any value in releasing those little fingerling shad that they're doing now? People are raising them and releasing them to recolonize rivers in North Carolina. Would there be any value in actually doing a test run, like letting some of those things go up in Perry Creek or someplace upstream and see what the survival is this year?
Well, we've got the national fish hatcheries, and we've got a fish hatchery in Edenton, and we realize that the production in a natural system exceeds what we can possibly produce in our fish hatchery system. In other words, if we can get the noose working, we could do the productivity of 4 or 5 national fish hatcheries.
Well, my question is really like, the macroinvertebrate populations in those headwater streams is very low. So there's not that much for these shad, hatchlings to eat.
Well,
that's what they're eating.
You're not looking at although the food form is small larvae, the fish, of course, when it's fertilized, you've got that egg sac, and then the eggs all set, and then they've got to feed. But really what you're doing is inoculating the downstream area. If you look at the distance between Falls Lake and the ocean, or the estuary, really your upstream areas are really inoculating that with the larvae and stuff that use that nursery habitat that's all those miles downstream. Okay. The important thing to think about, John, is that Hightower would be a good one to say this, but he would say multi-volcanic rock is basically a rocky, riffly area. And if you look at the noose, you've got some around Smithfield, you've got some around Goldsboro, but then when you're really getting into Raleigh, that's where you're really getting into the rocky bottom on the noose. When you go up towards Falls, if you've been in that stretch, that's really area. Primo habitat. So by getting the fish, there's plenty of area there to produce enough spawn to really utilize the nursery area habitat in the main stem noose. But there's not spawning habitat in all those miles of the coastal plain. It's just not suitable spawning habitat.
That helps. Thank you. Next question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to what Mike was saying. As far as even if Perry Creek was a good quality creek, probably wouldn't expect American shad to go up into those small creeks. It's kind of a river spawner. And then one other point to make is, the migratory fish is just one component of the aquatic restoration. If you look at our baseline studies, our upstream control sites and our downstream control sites, the fish community at the control sites was much more what we'd expect in a free-flowing river than what's in the impoundment. To give you an example, the freshwater mussels, as far as abundance, we measure abundance by how many we find in a certain period of time, how many per hour. The 6 sites within the impoundment, I think we're looking at 8 or 9 mussels per hour, whereas the downstream control sites were up in the hundreds per hour, and upstream control right near the Falls tail race, looking at 70 individuals. So there's definitely an adverse effect to those communities from existing dam.
Next question is from Janet Bussett.
Peace out.
I'm sorry. Forgive me.
Hello, everybody. I've been following this dog and pony show for 2 years. I live in Foxcroft, which borders the impoundment. The neighborhood's 180 acres. It's Raleigh's little secret. It's full of nature. You come in there and there's deer everywhere. Turtles that are 40 years old. So what I would ask as part of the process is somebody come in there and sample our neighborhood and see what we have before this happens and then after it happens. But I do want to say thank you to Mr. Rigsby, Martin Dole. I've been following your work for several years.
Thank you.
Actually, I read your thesis this week. Gave me a headache. Got through it. Yeah, so I have some firsthand experience, you know, like you, with the Lowell Dam, and I chime in with Mr. Brandel. I'm not going to repeat what he said, but what was interesting was that it was your hope that your research would help with future dam stream mitigation projects. Follow you there. I think that's great. I'm not going to fight or say the dam going away. I'm not going to go there. I'm going to go a different angle. Use that work that you have. I think it's great. It's not scientifically defensible because it's based on standards that you came up with. It's all research, but it's something that nobody else has probably done yet. Okay. What I think we need to do here, and I thank you that we have this opportunity to come together and get this out on the table. I've been into this for 2 years, and I'm getting a headache. So it's about time that all these leaders and everybody in the community got it out. Now, this is what I see. You have enough evidence so far with the Lowell Dam, all these other dams, but especially what Mr. Rigsby's done. You saw from the approach that you took, you didn't go in there and do the blow and go. Pretty much punctured a hole in it. April, you let out some water twice, and in December, you let some water out twice. Issue was, they didn't bank on. They had a high precipitation event. Then it rained again in January. They had a lot of downstream flooding. Of course, that's been documented. I gotta control my hands because I don't want you to get distracted by this. But the difference between Johnston County, and that's where I got a little of this twang from because I used to work for the mayor down here. The difference between where the Lowell Dam is and where this dam is almost like night and day. This is a highly populated area. Down there, it's not. I've been there. I've walked all around. What else I don't see in this plan? What's the emergency plan? What's the contingency plan? What are the site protections? What kind of bond are you going to put up? And 5 years is not good enough for me. I think it ought to be into perpetuity, or at least 10 years at a minimum. And I think something needs to be coordinated with the city of Raleigh to protect these people downstream, and it needs to get out on the table.
I'm sorry, protect them from what?
From a potential flood. Like Adam's document. Probably didn't hurt anybody when all that flooding happened. It was 13 days straight. You gonna correct me?
I'll respond to you.
You're the one that, I read your paper, am I wrong?
I can tell. Great detail.
Yeah, well, I think we need to do something. That's all I got to say.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for the comment. And two things to go out there. One is we did learn a lot from Lowell, and we've learned a lot from other dam removals that I did not participate in, and that we are fortunate enough to have a rich literature to go by. And when I say we learned a lot from Lowell, these two guys sitting to my right in particular, they're the ones that did a lot of the science that supported the mitigation project. My dissertation involved following flows through the reservoir after the dam was removed. The dam did not add flows, and I think that's an important distinction. The removal of that dam did not cause a flood. I monitored the movement of sediment and nutrients through the old impoundment during flood events. So what I was curious about, and with the help of Martin Doyle and a few of my colleagues there at UNC, was once the dam's removed, we know that that's a susceptible time for that impoundment, as you noted. It's sensitive. We were curious, what happens? What ends up leaving the impoundment that's been stored over 100+ years, and where does it go? And so we monitored dozens of miles of river, and we followed what I refer to as a flood wave in my paper, but it was not a flood. It never left the banks of the little river. It was simply a pulse of water with some sediment and some nutrients. So I need to make that distinction, and I will gladly answer questions about this because it's important. Removing Milburnie Dam is not going to cause flooding downstream, not during the process, and not because there's a rain event after the process. We will not we will not create a flood downstream. Now what may happen, and what you were referring to in that paper, is something that I did call a flood wave, and I wrote that out. So I'm now second guessing the use of that term 6 years later. But what it was it was during the dewatering process, and you're right, they released it twice. It was during the dewatering process, they opened the gates up, and there was what I should have called a pulse of water and material that moved downstream. So that's stored water behind the dam. It then enters the Little River, and it moves downstream. It never left the banks of the Little River, so it was not a flood. That is, Martin, you deserve to be reprimanded for letting me write that in that paper. It was not a flood wave, so I apologize for that. To summarize, two quick distinctions. You're right, Lowell is not Milburnie. We did learn some lessons at Lowell. We learned some lessons at Carbonton. But there were several more, thanks to American Rivers, you saw the slide, 1,000 other dam removals out there from which we can learn. And we can avoid making mistakes that have been made over 1,000 other dam removals. So there's a lot to learn there. And it's not going to flood downstream because we dewater Milburnie. That's an important distinction.
Next question is Terry Benton.
A lot of questions have been answered, I guess not answered this evening, but I guess at this time we'll have to take that. But we appreciate you being here tonight. A couple questions for the homeowners along the Neuse River. Ed touched on it. Will the debris be cleaned up from the river? Because when we watched the videos from my friend Janet went down and shot them, we found there was a lot of debris on the riverbank. It left a mess down there. People were very unhappy. Would the banks be seeded? And would Restoration Systems be willing to post a bond to compensate homeowners for lost wells? Our other concern is I live in Riverbend Plantation. When this first started coming around, people from Restoration Systems apparently went and spoke with our neighbors about the Stout Lake. And they expressed to the neighbors that when the dam goes away, there'll be no flooding in our neighborhood. So I'm concerned about the level of the water in Stout Lake as well, which is in our subdivision, which is Riverbend. We're concerned. And can you address whether that lake level will be affected if the dam is taken out?
I can give you very general answers. I am not familiar with that lake. I don't know how it's formed. Obviously, I would imagine there's a dam. It's probably not a natural lake.
Right.
I don't know the nature of that dam. I don't know where it's located relative to the Neuse River, and so honestly, I can't give you a good definitive
answer.
answer.
That'd be a question that I could pose and send it and give you the coordinates.
Yes, ma'am. I will gladly look into that.
And how about the wells that my neighbors are on, as far as damage to the wells if the dam goes away?
You know, that is a common fear with dam removal, is that, and it's logical concern, is that if you lower the water level in the river, do you affect the local groundwater table, the depth of that table, its placement in the soil? And in some cases, yes, locally you can see that. And the chances, and again, I'm not familiar with each individual well. We didn't see that problem at Lowell, and we didn't see that problem at Carbondale. I mean, George or John, were you ever called by somebody who couldn't draw groundwater because you removed the dam? So I think that groundwater is affected to a certain extent. The depth at which we usually drill in order to get groundwater for drinking water purposes is much greater than that dam is going to cause an affecting. So in other words, the straw goes so deep down to tap into the groundwater that I don't think the dam is going to have an effect.
I'm sorry, our neighbor and good friend Ed Smallwood couldn't be here tonight because he really is, I'm sure you're very familiar with that. He has the science behind him, and he really can listen to what you're saying and make sense of it, and then he can answer questions. And I wish he were here. I did bring a copy of the letter that he wrote in response to the public thing, but I'd love to hand it out if I could before I go. I guess probably they have it at the core, but he had so many questions that I'm not sure really still have been answered.
Well, I will gladly, please leave your information so that I can contact you.
And Lars
we
is
can talk
right at the
about
back of the room. You can leave all your information with him. Next question is Ted Dunn.
Hi, my name is Ted Dan. I live in the Woods Creek subdivision, which is adjacent to Foxcroft. And I think you've done an excellent job in your presentation. It's provided much more information than what I knew before. And I guess my position would be that I think that whenever we would extend the natural habitat of the Neuse River an additional 15 miles, that's very appealing. And as I listen to everything, I realize the Army Corps of Engineers can't say that they're either for this or against this, but they have to remain neutral. But I think that for the neighbors who may not be exactly adjacent to the river or the dam, but are in the vicinity and have these legitimate concerns, that you work through the process, as you've obviously done so far, to address their concerns. But one of the things that was touched on briefly that I think that in addition to extending the natural habitat of the river to what it used to be, is that we have a structure that no longer serves its original purpose. And with the extension of the greenway by the Raleigh Park system, it seems that we have what is, I'm not an attorney, but I think it would be referred to as almost like a public nuisance, in the sense that you have a dam that has taken lives before, and I know for where I grew up, that's what dams do. And like you said, they don't kill one person, oftentimes they kill two people, or the number of people that go to rescue the original victim. And so that if the current owners of this dam want the liability to go away, and they don't want the risk of future deaths on their property because of the proximity to the greenway, it's almost, if I was an attorney, we talk about the scales of justice, and rarely is anything ever 100%, and it won't, obviously isn't going to be 100% in your favor because of the concerns of the neighbors in Foxcroft and Woods Creek and perhaps Hedingham. But it would seem like as you would consider the life safety issues and so many of the things that we're talking about here, that you would still tip the scales in favor of what you want to do. So I am so impressed with what you've done. Attending this, I'm more likely to support what you're trying to do, but hope that you'll, for the neighbors, continue to address their individual concerns. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next question is from Cheryl Gregory.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay, great. Next question, John Hawley.
Listening with great interest to a lot of the information that's been presented. And one thing that I didn't hear a lot about, and I would just encourage you to take a look at if you haven't already, is the potential for head cutting and erosion in some of the tributaries that feed now into the open water. A lot of that is directly adjacent to or actually bordering on private land, and there could be some property damage that may result as a part of that erosion process that's going to naturally occur. And so some of that may need to be addressed structurally in the process of taking the dam out and doing some work to correct erosion, and I would encourage that to be looked at. And my question, I guess, would be, how much has that been looked at, and have you anticipated some potential problem areas?
Thanks for bringing that up, and that is obviously a concern that you have when you remove a dam. That's head cut migration is fairly common to see. And in certain situations, you want to see that. In other situations, like you just noted, you don't want to see that. So my biggest concern for head cuts right now is that open water area just below Beaver Dam Lake. And we're working to develop a strategy so that we don't have that problem there. Other areas that I have noted.
We were out there today.
Yeah, in fact we were. Other areas I've noted seem to have some hardened structures. There are dams with lots and lots and lots of riprap that connect the tail of the dam to the river. That's good. I mean, it's not great habitat, but that's great for a concern like you just voiced, and that we certainly share. And that will be part of the process to identify those spots and see what we can do to avoid the problems, because we want to avoid problems like that. That's important.
I just wanted to add, John, I actually spoke with Mel Nevels this morning, who I believe you work with. Right. And I was speaking with him on another matter. He brought this up too, and I committed to sitting down with you guys at Land Resources and going over it in some detail.
I believe this particular project will end up being under the city's jurisdiction. The city has a local sedimentation control program. Of course, it's delegated to them by us, and so we would be working hand in hand.
Well, y'all are experts too. We would involve the city as well.
Thank you,
Mr. Holly.
Jay St. Clair.
Hey guys, this gentleman over here sort of hit on my first question. I had two. The first one was, I was curious, is it a rumor or is it true that people have drowned here? And if so, how many people have drowned as a result of that dam?
Well, thanks, Mr. St. Clair. We got interested in that question after the 2 deaths this summer, and I asked a young fellow that works for us to go down to the News and Observer and to look it up. And it didn't take him too long. I think we identified 11 deaths that were in the paper that he was able to pull notice, some of them quite horrifying. 8 of those were doubles. In other words, there were 4 instances where 2 people died, including I don't mean to be dramatic, but a one-armed vegetable produce merchant who went in after his wife, who'd never swam a day in his life, and he only had one arm, went in after, and he went down, and that was at the cover then and now. But what we figure is that there are more single drownings out there that didn't get picked up by the paper because it's not as newsworthy when 2 die. So either they're, either it always kills in 2s, which is unlikely, or there are many more drownings than just the 11. So there's 11 known, and only 4 of those in the last 5 years. And I suspect, though, going back, it would be, many more and above 20.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a small park there that Carolyn and my father gave to the city to make a park where people can go that's public, a little bit of a public area. And there's postings and stuff about not swimming, but it's hot. It's 95 degrees in the summer, and you've got a 5-year-old who's with you fishing. It's just inevitable that somebody's going to tempt fate.
Right.
Well, that's an excellent point, and it brings up the greenway part. If you say that, the number of people that drown or get in trouble out there is a function of how many people visited in the first place, which would seem logical. That was a very obscure location in Raleigh. As we know, you can talk to a lot of people who've lived in Raleigh, some of them their whole lives, and you bring up the Milburnie Dam, they've never seen it. That's not going to be the case after they open up the full greenway to the new Blue Way. There are going to be thousands upon thousands of new visitors that never would have known that place was there. They're going to find the new swimming hole, and that's going to serve as an attractive nuisance that the twigs no longer want to maintain.
They put signs up, they rip them down, they've ripped through fences, it's just an impossible thing to keep up with.
And it's only going to get worse.
Right. What's scary too is that the water on the surface looks calm and still, but underneath it is where the strong current is. So it looks innocent, but it's not.
Right. Okay. Second question, I'll try to make this quick, is for Mr. Rigby. You did a good job talking about, I think, the theory behind, some of the negative impacts that are a result of a dam being put into a free-flowing stream. And you also talked about some of the ecological benefits that can come from removing a dam. So my question for you is, as part of this group, yourself, what have you witnessed and specifically documented, maybe some of the highlights of dam removals with this group?
In terms of the ecological changes?
The benefits.
I think the most remarkable accomplishment, if you will, or benefit was the Cape Fear Shiner in the Deep River. It was one of the only ecosystem restoration projects on the East Coast that I'm aware of where we got a federally protected species to recolonize a significantly long stretch of river, 10 miles plus additional miles in some of the larger tributaries. In fact, Tim continues to go back and document new occurrences of the species and further back into the old impoundment, which I think is just fascinating. We've also seen some great shifts in habitat. I mean, these guys have been through the river a lot more than I have, to be honest, because both those removals took place while I was conducting my dissertation research, and I did study them, but then I left in 2006, and these guys just kept going back year after year after year. So if they want to expand, I'll certainly pass it along.
So I, mentioned that the benthic macroinvertebrates are one of the first to change, and that's what we observed at both the dam removals that we're involved in. And, with them being the base of the food chain, it supported, I think, the fish species change that Tim will be able to comment on. And then ultimately, the fish are, I believe, the host for mussels, is that right? And so that's why the mussels are the last step in that process. But we also had, when the water goes down, there's a lot, the riverbed didn't always change as much. I mean, there's some sediment deposition, but then you also see, when the water goes down, the riffle and pool sequence gets reestablished, and so you have periods of shallow, fast water within deeper, slow water. And those were there immediately in the first year, but then even over successive years of monitoring, extra ones would pop up as sediment was getting cleared out of those. And so seeing those habitats established was really great, because it made, I always had to be safety conscious with our crews, but they loved going through those riffles on their canoes and stuff. And I mean, go, you have $15,000 worth of gear in that boat, and they just have fun. So, but, and so seeing that, and then there's, I've heard several folks say that there's great wildlife, and I totally understand that and agree with that, and I think that you're going to continue to see great wildlife, and you'll see a lot more birds all the way down along the creek, and wading birds, fishing, and I think that those things will continue.
Yeah, just add to that. As an aquatic ecologist, I love free-flowing rivers. And in a presentation I've done about the Carventon Dam removal, got a shot of me standing on a riffle spot, and I tell the story that when we did the pre-removal baseline surveys, it was 17 feet deep at that spot, and we had to scuba dive to sample the bottom, whereas we were doing it, wading, and riffle habitats are very species rich, very diverse, and as an ecologist, that's what you look for, And
right. Thanks, guys.
There really isn't a free-flowing river, though. The Corps release controls the release. Is that not true?
Can I speak up for a second?
It seems to be a good point, and it's something worth pointing out. But keep in mind, that's true for every river in North Carolina. If you're on the Roanoke, you're controlled from Carl Lake Dam, whatever they call that. If you're in the Cape Fear at any point, there are 17 dams on the Cape Fear. So at every point along the Cape Fear, it's controlled. Moving along, I think that there's no major river that reaches into the Piedmont in North Carolina that isn't controlled. That said, I think it'll put significant pressure on the Corps, if they can be prevailed upon, to probably do more nature-like releases there.
I think we know that this provides the water supply for Raleigh.
That's right.
considering the fact that the environment's changing as dramatically as it is, and there's bound to be a drought, a drastic drought, a dramatic drought, probably in our near future, in our lifetime, certainly. When the people need water more than the river needs water, what's going to happen then?
Well, just remember that the people who live in Smithfield have been dealing with the natural water level of that river, and it's never gone dry. You've never heard them
Smithfield's
say.
a lot smaller community.
Right, but the river has continued to flow. The Neuse has never gone dry below the dam. There's always been a flowing river, even during the 2007 drought. Right? So, yeah, and there's a minimum release. There's a law that says that there is a serious. Not a law?
No, it's an agreement.
Is it? Okay. An agreement that they have to release a certain amount of water for ecological purposes.
And folks, can we just ask anyone who's asking a question, since we are recording this for official U.S. Army Corps of Engineer records, that you ask your questions at the microphone? And we have one more person who registered that they wanted to ask a question, so I want to get to them
Well, Matt, if
first.
it's okay, just we'll wrap this up and
Oh,
move
great,
to the next
okay,
person.
please.
In the document, there is a hydrological analysis because that's required by the Corps. In other words, will there be a sustainable flow regime to support the ecosystem we are proposing to restore? And our analysis indicates that yes, there should be. Now, extreme events are extreme events. The Neuse would run dry if we are in that type of drought, as you indicated, regardless of whether Falls Lake is there or not. So, you know, we can't.
We're talking about Milburnie Dam, though. There'd still be a buffer.
Well, it too would run dry if it was such an extreme event. I mean, Milburnie doesn't create water, it just holds on to it, which evaporates or goes downstream or whatever the case may be. So in this case, George was mentioning an agreement that Smithfield has with the Army Corps of Engineers and the state governments to release water for water quality purposes downstream. In other words, I believe it's Smithfield that has a wastewater discharge. And so if there's not enough water being released from falls, then that's heavily concentrated pollution, high amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. And they want to avoid that, and they want to avoid the smell that comes with it. So that's why you see a fairly reliable release. And again, I wrote this document so long ago, I don't recall all the details immediately, but it's in there. It's under a hydrological analysis section. And if you have questions after reading that, please get back with me or follow up with me again, and I will have read it more thoroughly and will be able to more accurately answer that.
I'll just add one thing to your question about is it a free-flowing natural river? It's not natural. As George mentioned, it is regulated, but our control sites, which were upstream of the current impoundment, we showed that the fish fauna and the freshwater mussel fauna are kind of what you'd expect from a free-flowing river system. So we expect that those species to recolonize the impoundment that's created by Milburnie.
It's unfortunate. I understand the Twig's point of view that they want to get rid of the dam. I know there have been several people that have said that they would speak to them on a private basis. In fact, Ed Smallwood went to Winston-Salem to speak with Carolyn Fox, and he was intercepted by Mr. Howard. He didn't want to allow that conversation to go on.
Ma'am, that's not true.
That's not true?
No, I went down with him, greeted him with her. She asked me to come with him because she felt a little bit intimidated that someone wanted to come try to talk her out of something.
Well, Ed's not intimidating. He was,
Well,
in fact, he felt her
She
discomfort
wanted me to
that
come
day,
there and
so-
be with her.
Uh-huh.
Yes, and I didn't intercept, and we rode down in the elevator together, welcomed her back to her room, and I did my best to answer the questions that she couldn't answer.
Well, I guess
Did you
it's-
limit the number of questions that Mr. Smallwood could ask?
No.
All right, next, and our last final question that someone had indicated ahead of time, and then we can take a few more while we have time available, is Jeff, and I'm sorry if I get this wrong, Destreich?
It's a follow-up, I think, on the hydrological question. Is there any hydrological effect on the 9 miles above the pool? Is there any shock absorber effect from having that pool down there? Or a rate change?
Could you rephrase the question for me? I'm sorry.
On the section of river above the pool, the pool water where it's
Within the impoundment though?
Above the impoundment, between the impoundment and Falls Dam.
Okay.
Is there going to be any hydrological change to that? Is the flow going to go faster or?
You know, I expect the answer is imperceivably yes. You know, impoundments, we have to draw a line and say the effect stops here, but that's not necessarily true because there's secondary effects. So I think, yes, it could get a little bit faster, but I don't think that you would notice, to be honest.
All right, and I believe we have time for 2 more questions. Sir?
I had indicated I wanted to ask a question. I'm Gene Hayden from Foxcroft, and my interest in the river is that I canoe the river with my children and my grandchildren, so I really enjoy the impoundment area because I can canoe right down to where my property is. But my question is, the real reason for taking down the dam is to receive the mitigation credits, and the goals that you have are to achieve, or to measure how much credit you get. And I notice you guys sitting at the table here are pretty much all of the same community. You're interlinked to some degree. And I suppose in monitoring the river that those monitoring studies are paid for by IRS, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Now, my question is, how do you maintain your independence when your client is going to be the person who benefits from your results? And who monitors your independence? That would be my question.
I'll be glad to take a shot at that. And obviously, Restoration Systems is the sponsor of the Mitigation Bank. As you've heard from the owners of the dam tonight, the dam is their private property. They wish to see it removed. We've been engaged in an effort with them to go through the permitting process. The team of consultants we have up here tonight does work for many other clients, much bigger and more powerful than Restoration Systems. And their projects have to be reviewed by the Corps of Engineers too. So I think that in the spirit of a positive discourse, you shouldn't cast aspersions on the team of consultants we have up here tonight or the quality of their work, because if there was a made as instructed type of work product, they would not have any credibility with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for other clients. And instead, they have a great deal of credibility based on their track record of long, successful projects.
I want to speak to the integrity of your data.
Yeah. I understand why you would ask the question. I get it. And I'm sure you understand the response I'm about to give you, which is I like to be a person of integrity. I went to school studying systems that I love, and I hoped that when I got out, I could be a part of something that was giving back, and that wasn't taking paychecks, and that was the only concern. I like to get paid, I'll be honest. I do have 2 small children and a wife and a house, so I do have to pay the bills, but I don't do it at the expense of my integrity, and I don't think these guys do either.
I'll just add to that. We are contracted by Restoration Systems, but the amount that we get paid has no bearing on whether they receive maximum credit or no credit. We're getting paid the same amount regardless. I mean, if the dam's removed and Restoration Systems aren't awarded any credits, we're still going to be expecting our paycheck. So
not being paid by the shad.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
All right, we have time for one final question.
I believe I put my name on or check mark.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, it looks like we missed a couple. Please come on up. And could you just state your name when you get to the microphone as well?
Hi, my name is Farrell Benton. I live right on the river. I enjoy the river for the way it is. I'm wondering why the late adapted species are such a bad thing. It looks like they're all going to go away, and in return we'll get 1, maybe 2 each opportunity to watch the shad swim by and somewhat catch them. Also, I didn't realize they were an endangered species. I also understand that they are commercially fished. So I can't imagine that would be allowed if that were in fact the case. The other thing is, we noticed in our neighborhood, we have a little lake there. We spend a lot of money maintaining the lake. It's a lake called Lake Iris. I'm surprised you didn't notice it. It backs right up to the dam.
I'm sure I noticed it. I don't know which one is yours.
Okay.
That's my problem. Sorry about that.
But when the water level in the river comes up due to flooding or due to releases from the dam, Falls Lake Dam, our neighborhood floods, and it doesn't flood by coming back up over the dam. It comes up, it seeps up through the sand. So we know that the sand is coarse enough to allow water to come up through it. So obviously it's going to be coarse enough that water goes back down through it. So when that level goes down, our lake's going to go away. 99% positive of that. And I'm just wondering, how we'd be compensated for that.
A lot of questions there. I think, Tim, would you address the species questions?
Yeah, the lake adapted species, they won't disappear. They'll inhabit pools, as Adam mentioned earlier, rather than a homogeneous river of just deep pool habitat. You'll have ripple runs and pools, and so those species that are there now, we expect them to continue to be there, just not totally dominated. It'll be a more ecologically diverse fish fauna. The bit about the American shad being endangered, that's if
none of us suggest
it's not an endangered species. There are state endangered, state threatened species that do occur in the Neuse River, and we hope to see a benefit to those species from removal. And that's maybe where the confusion came from.
Again, in reference to the dam, I'll certainly follow up with you guys on that. That is the same lake, correct? That you were referring to, ma'am? Okay. Okay, great. So we'll follow up with you on that. Again, I don't know the location exactly. I do know the soils fairly well through that floodplain area along the whole impoundment, and it's not as much sand as you think. Now, your location may be a completely different story, and I just haven't seen it and haven't been on the ground yet. But what I know going up and down that impoundment is a whole heck of a lot of fine sediment. And fine sediment doesn't actually allow for a lot of flow up and down. It traps water and holds onto it very effectively. That's just my observation across the reach as a whole. I'm not trying to discredit or challenge your observations over time. You know your place better than I do. But I'll gladly make a visit, and I will learn what I can learn, and I'll share with you what I learn.
If the water level ever changes that dramatically in the near future, I'll make sure I...
Is there a dam in place now, sir? Okay, so chances are good, and again, I'll learn more once I'm on the ground. Chances are good someone built that dam to hold water that was coming upslope. That's what dams are for. They didn't build the dam to hold water that comes in underground, because you wouldn't need a dam if it just simply exchanged underground. So a dam usually traps surface water, not groundwater. It's not always the case, but the position of the dam that I'm just assuming based on what I've learned here tonight suggests to me that it's capturing water coming from upslope along the bank, and then it's holding it in place. So your experience, again, I'm not trying to argue with it.
Modified. I couldn't tell you exactly what the slope is.
But I'll be glad to take a look, and everything I learn, I will share.
Right. Oh, Mike.
Yeah, I wanted to add, I think, one thing, if you think about it, I work with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I'm a civil servant to the population of the country, the state, the city, and locals. But the way I look at it is that I think there's a real misconception about why we would support this type of thing. And if you look at just look at the stretch of river from the dam, past your property or even up to the lake, and the benefit that people would have seeing the fish, American shad, sturgeon, whatever, as it relates to that property, is relatively finite. It's, you know, it's like you said, what's the benefit if I see a shad, or even if there's 10 people fishing for them, what's the big deal? There's not that big a deal about that. But the thing you've got to bear in mind is that the fish that spawn in this area are the same ones that feed the speckled trout, the puppy drum, the flounders, the bluefish, the tunas, the mackerels, the dolphins. So when you go down to Oriental or go down to Atlantic Beach, or if you look at the recreational fishing industry in North Carolina, it's a $1.4 billion industry. There's a lot of people that make their living do that. A lot of people's children have their jobs. So it's a state and federal resource. If it was a private farm pond or a private lake, absolutely. But the thing is, I think there's a problem in that some people consider the river their lake, and actually it is very important to the populace of the state and the country, and that's the reason we're interested in it. If there wasn't a huge benefit, you know, I would personally never support it, because it obviously, you know, some people love the dam and think it's pretty and that kind of thing.
The question I'd have about that is to have the least impact, why wouldn't a fish ladder be just as effective?
We're building a fish ladder, the Corps of Engineers is, on Lock and Dam number 1. It's a $13 million project. Now, I've got we've got steep pass ladders at Holtz Lake. In other words, that's one of the things I interact with, is building fish ladders. It's not, to build a fish ladder on Milburnie Dam would probably cost several $100,000. We've been trying to get funding to build a fish ladder at Crabtree Creek, which is owned by the city of Raleigh. They're pretty sweet on it. I mean, they've got no objection. The homeowners there that are the controlling interest at Laster's Mill Dam, and I haven't talked to the people that live around the dam, but I feel fairly confident in dealing with this type of things before, is that if we built it and it looked nice in keeping with that historic structure, they'd be fine with it. The problem is there's no money to do things like that. We're under I think the notion that fish ladders are relatively inexpensive is generally not true. They're fairly expensive. The idea that
several $1 million in credits though, available to
I'll gladly
restoration.
I'll answer the question there, Mike.
Yeah.
So in core speak, that would be an alternative. And the alternative wouldn't work for two reasons. One, Mike was getting at it. It's expensive. And just because we passed shad over Milburnie doesn't mean that it generates enough credits to pay for the fish ladder. In fact, it probably doesn't. That's the least productive ecological component of this project in terms of credit potential. We have to think like that. This is a project that is, you know, has a budget. And whatever credits we generate have to be able to sell to recoup the cost. The other thing is that it probably increases their liability at the site. You still have a dam in place. That hasn't gone away. And now you probably added another nuisance on top of it. Now you're going to have the potential for people to climb up and down a fish ladder. That sounds like you've just increased on an old structure. Right, and George brought that point up earlier, that, you know, you're putting some nice new piece of technology on top of a very old foundation. So
as far as that goes, as far as where there's a concern for safety, now taking that dam down is just going to expose more areas of rocks and places where the current isn't obvious all along the riverbank, and that together with the greenway, I would think the safety issue is sort of just going to be dispersed. It's just going to be moved.
The simple fact is the owners don't perceive it that way, and they're the ones that are bearing the cost and the anxiety for your aesthetic pleasure. And I don't mean that as flippant as it sounds, but that's what's going on now. They're no longer willing to bear that. Okay, so even if some alternatives, their opinion is the most important opinion in the room.
Well,
if they didn't want the dam removed, we wouldn't be here.
But if it were open for other people to purchase the dam, I mean, that's certainly a
There are
conversation.
more than one concern. What I want to say is I really honor and appreciate your long patience with this long process.
Mm-hmm.
And I also understand that you have private concerns for your private property because it's going to affect your private property. As I tried to say, and I'm not a public speaker, but
my father did not go into this without thinking this through. He was a citizen of Raleigh in a big way. He cared deeply about the public. And he chose these people because he knows they were going to do something that was going to have the least negative damage as possible for everybody else. So the only thing I want to say is, I want to know that I honor and hear your concerns, and it is my hope that this process of what you've seen will at least alleviate some of your concerns. There will be change. Change is inevitable. Change will happen. Change is hard, and there's going to be pros and cons for everybody. And I have to reiterate what George said. Honestly, I'm really just following through with my father's wishes. I've not been that involved in the process, although he talked to me a lot about it. But I'm seeing why he wanted to make this decision. He had grave concerns for Carolyn and her family, as you could imagine. And in addition, he was very concerned about liability. And he did have an environmental concern. So it's on several levels. It's not just about shad. It's not just about lake levels. It's about so many things. And my hope is that although it will change the area, it will still be really beautiful. I think it will still be really beautiful. And I don't think my dad would have chosen this path if he thought he was going to leave a mess for other people. He wasn't that person. I really don't think that's going to happen. And I hope the hard work of these people, this presentation, it certainly impressed me. And I hope you see there really is a genuine effort. It's not about, money will be made. There's money in this process. That's how it's going to work. But it's not about coming in and just raping the land and rolling over people and taking the money. And it's really not.
Well, we love the river as well. We're out there every year.
I know.
Cleaning up. We're very much participating.
I know. And I appreciate you guys being so participatory. And
another thing about the dam going away, that's going to make the river accessible to canoers and kayakers. The people who now can take advantage of miles of the river by going in another boat other than a kayak or boat, canoe, will lose access to that river. I have elderly uncles, elderly father-in-law that really very much love to come and go fishing there. That's going to go away for them. There's no way that they'll be able to access that 8-mile stretch. And I'm just wondering, if there aren't other people that are not as well enabled, and all you guys are going to be old someday, maybe would like to have something like that available to you. It's just a comment, and I think it's a fair comment to say you're taking something away other than the monetary value you're getting out of it.
I think that's under comment.
I work around dams a lot. I have the unfortunate task sometimes of talking to parents whose children have died at dams. I talked to the Apex Fire Department that pulled up the 2 kids that drowned last summer, and it's hard for somebody like me. As far as I know, I may have liabilities working on fish ladders and having people drownings, but liabilities don't drive somebody like me. But what does drive me is that if I know that you're doing something that will ultimately result in a child's death that was avoidable, that's a very driving thing for somebody like me. And I think
more kids drowned in buckets than drowned down there.
If the hydraulic beneath Milburnie Dam, underneath the tail race, episodically is such that I couldn't swim past it. I don't think anybody could swim through it. I'll take you out there and show you sometime if you'd like to. It's a death trap, and it's not a situation where somebody can't swim. That's not what it is. I'll be happy to show it to you if you'd like me to.
All right, folks. I think
any body water is a death trap.
No, absolutely.
If your children are not.
I'm talking. Yeah, I'll be happy.
Water.
Right. That's not correct.
Yeah.
The potential to drown in anything is there, but this curler hydraulic, it's a death trap.
All right, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and staying a lot longer than we all originally planned.
If we have more questions,
yes, if you have more questions, Lars is at the back of the room. Please go to him and you can register your name, contact information, and who you think would be the best person from the team up here to respond to you, and we will get back to you. Thank you all.
And a special thanks to Tiffany Bynum.
Thank you, Tiffany.